Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little darker. A place where poverty had rules, and mercy had a closing time, where being poor wasn't a condition, it was a punishment. Forget chimney sweeps and Oliver Twist. This is the true story of what happened inside a Victorian workhouse. You probably wouldn't last a day. So before we begin, take a breath, turn down the lights. If this kind of storytelling brings you peace or sleep, feel free to like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time the night found you. Now the bell is ringing. It's time to wake up, but you're already late, and there is no breakfast waiting. The rain falls steadily on the cobblestones outside, each drop finding its way into the spaces between stones that have been worn smooth by countless footsteps of the desperate. The sound creates a gentle percussion, a rhythm that seems to echo the heartbeat of someone walking slowly toward a destination they never wanted to reach. Tonight that someone is you. The Victorian workhouse looms before you like a monument to society's failures, its brick walls darkened by decades of industrial soot and human sorrow. This is where England sends its inconvenient poor, those who have fallen through the cracks of a rapidly changing world that values productivity above all else. The building itself tells a story before you even cross its threshold. Gothic Revival architecture was chosen deliberately, not for beauty, but for intimidation. The tall, narrow windows are designed to let in just enough light to work by, but never enough to feel welcoming. The heavy wooden doors, reinforced with iron bands, suggest permanence rather than passage. This is not a place you visit. This is a place where you remain until circumstances beyond your control decide otherwise. The architect understood perfectly what the Poor Law Commissioners wanted. A structure that would announce to anyone approaching that hope should be abandoned at the entrance. You stand before these doors with whatever possessions you could carry, which in your case amounts to little more than the clothes on your back, and perhaps a small bundle containing the remnants of a life that has collapsed around you. The weight of that bundle feels both insignificant and impossibly heavy. These few items represent everything you have managed to preserve from whatever circumstances brought you here. Perhaps it was unemployment when the factory closed, or illness that prevented you from working, or simply the misfortune of growing old in a society that discards people like worn-out machinery. The reasons matter less now than the simple fact of your presence here, at this threshold between the world of the living and something that exists in the spaces between dignity and survival. The porter who opens the door does so with the practiced efficiency of someone who has performed this ritual countless times. His face shows neither kindness nor cruelty, merely the neutral expression of a man who has learned to see people as paperwork to be processed rather than individuals with stories worth hearing. He gestures for you to enter without speaking, and you step across the threshold into a world governed by rules you do not yet understand, but will learn to obey without question. The door closes behind you with a sound that seems to echo longer than physics should allow, as though the building itself is making note of another soul entering its care. Inside, the administrative office smells of ink, damp paper, and something else that might be resignation made manifest. The walls are painted in a pale green that was probably chosen for its practical ability to hide stains, rather than for any aesthetic consideration. Behind a wooden desk that has been scarred by years of desperate signatures and angry fists, sits the workhouse clerk, a thin man whose spectacles reflect the gaslight in a way that makes his eyes impossible to read clearly. His pen moves across ledger pages with mechanical precision, recording details about people in the same tone one might use to catalogue inventory in a warehouse. The questions begin immediately, though they feel less like an interview and more like an interrogation designed to strip away whatever identity you might still claim. Your name? Though it hardly matters, since you will soon be known primarily by a number. Your age? which determines which category of labor you will be assigned to perform. Your previous occupation, if any, though the clerk's expression suggests that whatever work you once did was probably not important enough to have prevented you from ending up here. Your marital status, because the workhouse has specific procedures for separating families in ways that maximize efficiency while minimizing the possibility that emotional connections might interfere with the daily routine. Each answer you provide is recorded in a script so neat it seems to drain the humanity from whatever information you have shared. The clerk writes your story in abbreviations and codes that reduce a lifetime of experiences to a few marks on paper that will be filed away and rarely consulted again. This process of documentation serves multiple purposes beyond simple record keeping. It establishes immediately that your individual circumstances are less important than your classification within the workhouse system. You are not a person with a unique history who deserves individual consideration. You are a case to be managed according to established procedures that have been refined through years of practice. When the questions are finished, you are asked to sign your name in the admissions book, or if you cannot write, to make your mark with an X. This moment carries more weight than might be immediately apparent. Your signature or mark is not simply an acknowledgement that you have entered the workhouse voluntarily. It is a legal document that grants the institution certain rights over your person and your time. By signing, you agree to abide by rules that you have not been shown, to perform work that has not been described, and to accept punishments for infractions that have not been explained. The pen feels heavier than it should in your hand, as though the ink itself understands the significance of what you are about to do. The act of writing your name or making your mark feels like the final step in a process of transformation that began when you first realized you would need to seek admission to the workhouse. With each letter you form, or with the simple X you draw, if literacy was not among the privileges your life afforded you, you are acknowledging that whatever identity you possessed in the outside world has become insufficient to sustain you. The workhouse does not care who you were before you arrived. It cares only about who you will become under its supervision, which is to say, someone who follows instructions without question and performs assigned tasks without complaint. After the paperwork is completed, you are led deeper into the building for what the staff refers to as the admission process, though it might more accurately be described as the systematic removal of everything that connects you to the person you were before crossing the threshold. This process begins with the confiscation of your clothes, which are taken away to be stored, cleaned, or, in many cases, simply disposed of if they are deemed too worn or inappropriate to preserve. The official explanation is that this is done for hygiene purposes, to prevent the spread of disease and parasites that might be carried by clothing worn in the outside world. The reality is more complex and considerably less charitable. Removing your clothes serves the practical purpose of ensuring that all residents are dressed identically in workhouse uniforms, which makes supervision easier and prevents the kind of individual expression that might lead to the formation of personal identity or group solidarity. But the psychological impact is perhaps more significant than the practical considerations. Clothing represents one of the most basic forms of self-expression, a way of presenting yourself to the world that reflects your personal taste, economic circumstances, and cultural background. Taking away your clothes is taking away one of the fundamental ways you have defined yourself as an individual. The workhouse uniform you are given in exchange for your own clothing has been designed with the same careful attention to detail that characterizes every aspect of the institution, which is to say, it has been designed to serve multiple purposes beyond simple necessity. The fabric is coarse and durable, chosen not for comfort but for its ability to withstand constant wear and frequent washing with harsh soap. The cut is deliberately unflattering, designed to obscure rather than complement the human form. The color is invariably drab, usually gray or brown, chosen specifically for its ability to absorb rather than reflect light, creating an overall impression of shadowed resignation. More important than the practical characteristics of the uniform are its symbolic functions. By dressing everyone identically, the workhouse eliminates one of the most visible markers of individual identity and personal history. A person's clothing typically tells a story about their occupation, their economic status, their personal taste, and their cultural background. Workhouse uniforms tell only one story, which is that the person wearing them has fallen to the lowest rung of society's ladder and has been classified as requiring institutional management rather than individual consideration. The process of being measured for your uniform involves a level of physical examination that feels invasive and dehumanizing, though it is conducted with the same clinical efficiency that characterizes all workhouse procedures. Your measurements are recorded not because the workhouse provides custom-fitted clothing, but because the information will be used to assign you to various categories that will determine everything from your sleeping arrangements to your work assignments. Tall, strong individuals will be directed toward physically demanding labor like stone breaking or bone crushing. Smaller, more delicate people might be assigned to tasks like rope picking or textile work that require fine motor skills rather than brute strength. Throughout this process, you are expected to remain silent and compliant. Questions about the procedures are discouraged, and complaints about the treatment are simply ignored. The staff members who conduct the admission process have performed these same tasks hundreds or thousands of times, and they have developed a professional detachment that allows them to treat human beings as objects to be processed rather than individuals deserving of consideration or respect. This detachment is not necessarily born of cruelty, though cruelty is certainly present in some cases. More often, it represents a psychological defense mechanism that allows people to perform dehumanizing work without being constantly confronted with the moral implications of their actions. The transformation from individual to institutional resident is completed when you are assigned your number, which will be used to identify you in all official workhouse records and communications. Your name will still be known and occasionally used, but it becomes secondary to your numerical designation. You might be Pauper 47 or Inmate 23, depending on the specific terminology favored by your particular workhouse. The number serves practical purposes in terms of record keeping and organization, but its psychological impact extends far beyond administrative convenience. Being reduced to a number represents the final step in the process of stripping away individual identity that began when you first approached the workhouse doors. Numbers do not have histories, personal preferences, hopes, dreams, or emotional needs. Numbers can be manipulated, organized, and controlled without moral consideration. By becoming a number, you cease to be a person who happens to be experiencing temporary difficulties and become instead a problem to be managed according to established procedures. The admission process concludes with your assignment to living quarters, work detail, and daily schedule, all of which have been determined by your age, gender, physical condition, and the current needs of the workhouse operation. These assignments are presented to you as facts rather than choices, because choice is a luxury that the workhouse cannot afford to provide and would not choose to provide even if resources were unlimited. The philosophy underlying the entire poor law system is based on the belief that poverty results from moral failings rather than economic circumstances, and that the solution to poverty involves the systematic elimination of choice and personal agency until individuals learn to make better decisions. Your first night in the workhouse passes slowly, filled with unfamiliar sounds and sensations that will gradually become routine, but which initially serve as constant reminders that you are no longer in control of your environment or your circumstances. The bed is hard, the blanket thin, and the air filled with the sounds of other people adapting to their own losses of freedom and dignity. Some residents whisper quietly to each other when they think the staff cannot hear, sharing fragments of the stories that brought them to this place. Others lie in silence, perhaps trying to process the magnitude of the change in their circumstances, or perhaps simply exhausted by the emotional and physical demands of the admission process. As you lie in the darkness of the dormitory, listening to the breathing of dozens of other people who have made the same journey from independence to institutional dependence, you begin to understand that entering the workhouse involves more than simply seeking shelter and food during difficult times. It involves accepting a fundamental redefinition of yourself as someone who has failed at the basic task of self-sufficiency that society expects of all adults. The workhouse does not simply house the poor. It teaches the poor to understand their poverty as a personal failing that requires institutional correction rather than social support. The rain continues to fall outside, but you can no longer hear it clearly through the thick walls and small windows of your new home. The sound that filled your ears as you approached the workhouse has been replaced by the subtle but persistent sounds of institutional life. People shifting in their sleep, the creak of old floorboards, the distant sound of staff members making their rounds to ensure that everyone is where they are supposed to be and doing what they are supposed to be doing. These sounds will become the soundtrack of your days and nights, for however long circumstances require you to remain within these walls. Sleep comes fitfully, interrupted by the unfamiliar sensations of institutional life and the psychological weight of everything you have lost and accepted in the course of a single day. Tomorrow will bring new routines, new rules, and new lessons about what it means to survive in a place that has been designed to discourage survival by making it as unpleasant as possible while still maintaining the pretense of charitable assistance. The workhouse has accepted you into its care, but that care comes with conditions and expectations that will reshape every aspect of your daily existence. Your entry into the workhouse is complete, but your education in the realities of institutional poverty has only just begun. The building that seemed so imposing from the outside has welcomed you into its embrace, and like all embraces from institutions designed to manage rather than nurture, it is both protective and suffocating. You are safe from the immediate threats of homelessness and starvation, but you have purchased that safety with the surrender of almost everything that previously defined you as an autonomous individual, capable of making decisions about your own life. Chapter 2. The uniform and the rules. The first thing you notice about your new clothes is the color, or rather the deliberate absence of color. The gray fabric seems to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating an overall impression that you have somehow become less visible, less present in the world than you were when you wore your own clothing. This particular shade of gray was not chosen accidentally. The workhouse commissioners spent considerable time selecting a color that would serve multiple purposes simultaneously. It needed to be practical enough to hide the inevitable stains that would accumulate from months of wear without replacement. It needed to be drab enough to discourage any sense of personal pride or individual expression. Most importantly, it needed to be immediately recognizable to anyone who saw it, marking the wearer as someone who had fallen to the bottom of society's hierarchy and was now subject to institutional control. The fabric itself tells a story of intentional discomfort. Woven from the coarsest wool available, it scratches against your skin with every movement, a constant reminder of your changed circumstances. The wool has been processed using the cheapest methods available, which means it retains much of its natural roughness and tendency to irritate sensitive skin. After a few hours of wear, you begin to understand that this discomfort is not an unfortunate side effect of economical manufacturing, but rather a deliberate feature designed to ensure that wearing the workhouse uniform never becomes comfortable or familiar. Your skin develops red patches where the fabric rubs most persistently, around your neck, wrists, and ankles, creating a sort of physical signature that marks you as clearly as any badge or identification card. The fit of your uniform has been determined not by your individual measurements, but by whatever sizes happen to be available in the workhouse stores at the time of your admission. The philosophy behind this approach reflects the institution's broader attitude toward individual needs and preferences. If the garment is too large, you are expected to adapt by rolling up sleeves and trouser legs, creating an appearance that suggests you have somehow shrunk within your clothes. If it is too small, you must make do with restricted movement and the constant awareness that your clothing might split or tear with any sudden motion. Either way, you are reminded constantly that your comfort and dignity are secondary to the administrative convenience of maintaining a standardized inventory of clothing in limited sizes. The psychological impact of wearing ill-fitting clothes extends far beyond mere physical discomfort. Clothing that fits properly allows a person to move through the world with confidence and ease, without constant awareness of their physical presentation. Clothing that fits poorly creates a state of perpetual self-consciousness, a constant awareness that something is wrong with your appearance that others can surely notice. In the workhouse, this self-consciousness serves the important function of undermining whatever confidence or sense of personal worth you might have retained despite your reduced circumstances. It becomes difficult to maintain dignity when your sleeves extend past your fingertips or your trousers bunch awkwardly around your ankles. Within days of receiving your uniform, you discover that you possess only one complete set of clothing, and that replacement garments are not provided until your current set becomes literally unwearable. This policy means that any damage to your uniform, whether caused by normal wear, accidents, or the demands of your assigned labor, must be endured until the garment completely fails. Small tears grow larger with each day's activities. Stains from food, work materials, or bodily functions accumulate and set permanently into the fabric because proper cleaning requires removing the garment, and you have nothing else to wear while it is being washed. The absence of spare clothing creates a state of constant vulnerability that affects both your physical comfort and your psychological well-being. Every day brings new opportunities for damage to your only set of clothes, and every instance of damage brings you closer to the humiliation of appearing in public wearing obviously deteriorated garments. You learn to move carefully, to avoid situations that might result in tears or stains, to modify your behavior in ways that prioritize the preservation of your clothing over your own comfort or efficiency. This constant vigilance becomes exhausting, adding another layer of stress to days that are already filled with more challenges than most people can easily manage. The workhouse laundry system operates on a schedule that prioritizes efficiency over cleanliness or individual comfort. Your uniform is collected for washing perhaps once every 2 weeks, sometimes less frequently if the laundry staff is overwhelmed with other duties or if equipment breaks down. On washing day, you surrender your clothing in the morning and receive it back in the evening, still damp and smelling of the harsh lye soap used to process dozens of garments simultaneously. During the hours when your uniform is being washed, you remain in bed wearing only your undergarments, which are themselves part of the workhouse's standardized clothing system and subject to the same policies regarding replacement and maintenance. The soap used in the workhouse laundry is made from animal fat and lye, creating a product that is effective at removing some types of dirt and organic matter, but harsh enough to damage both fabric and human skin. After multiple washings with this soap, your uniform begins to develop a texture that is somehow both stiff and thin, as though the fibers have been simultaneously hardened and weakened by repeated chemical assault. The color fades unevenly, creating patches and streaks that make the garment look even more institutional and degraded. Your skin, when it comes into contact with freshly washed clothing, often develops rashes and irritation that can take days to heal, only to be renewed when the next washing cycle brings newly treated fabric into contact with sensitive areas. The presence of lice becomes apparent within your first week of residence, though the staff treats this as an inevitable and largely unremarkable aspect of institutional life, rather than a crisis requiring immediate attention. The insects seem to thrive in the coarse wool of the uniforms, finding ample hiding places in the thick weave and abundant food sources among residents who have limited opportunities for thorough personal hygiene. The itching they cause becomes another constant sensation that joins the scratching of the fabric and the discomfort of poor fit in creating a persistent awareness of physical discomfort. Attempts to remove lice from your uniform are largely futile, given the limited resources available to residents. The harsh soap used in the laundry may kill some of the insects, but it is not specifically designed for pest control, and the eggs often survive the washing process to hatch later. Fine combs for removing lice eggs are not provided, and the rough texture of the fabric makes it difficult to detect and remove the small parasites manually. Most residents eventually accept the presence of lice as simply another unpleasant aspect of workhouse life, focusing their attention on more pressing concerns like food, work assignments, and avoiding punishment for infractions of the institutional rules. The stains that accumulate on your uniform tell the story of your daily activities in ways that would be embarrassing if anyone in the workhouse possessed sufficient social status to be embarrassed by their appearance. Food stains mark the locations where you have eaten meals with insufficient utensils or have been careless with the thin gruel that constitutes most of your nutrition. Work stains reflect the nature of your assigned labor, whether that involves the black dust of coal handling, the brown residue of bone crushing, or the various colorations produced by textile work or laundry duties. Sweat stains develop in predictable patterns that reflect the physical demands of your daily routine and the limited opportunities for bathing or changing clothes. Each stain becomes a permanent part of your uniform because the laundry system is not designed to address individual garments with special attention. Your clothes are processed in large batches using methods that prioritize speed and volume over careful treatment of specific items. Stains that might be removed with targeted treatment and appropriate cleaning agents instead become set permanently into the fabric, creating a visual record of your activities that cannot be erased or hidden. Over time, your uniform develops a unique pattern of discoloration that serves as a sort of identification system, allowing staff and other residents to recognize you from a distance based on the specific combination of stains and wear patterns that mark your particular garment. The transformation from individual with a name to institutional resident with a number occurs gradually but inevitably as the daily routines of workhouse life reshape your understanding of your own identity. Your number is used in all official communications, work assignments, meal distribution, and disciplinary actions. It appears on the small slate or piece of paper that might be attached to your uniform or kept with your personal effects. Staff members use your number when referring to you in their discussions, and you quickly learn to respond when your number is called during roll call, work assignments, or distribution of meals. The psychological impact of being reduced to a number extends far beyond the simple inconvenience of learning to respond to a different form of identification. Numbers do not have personal histories, individual preferences, emotional needs, or unique characteristics that require special consideration. By becoming a number, you cease to be a person who happens to be experiencing temporary difficulties and become instead a unit of institutional inventory to be managed according to standardized procedures. Your number allows the staff to think about you and treat you as an abstract entity rather than a human being with feelings, needs, and rights that might complicate the efficient operation of the institution. The process of learning to think of yourself primarily as a number rather than as a person with a name represents one of the most profound psychological adjustments required by workhouse life. Your name connects you to your personal history, your family relationships, your individual achievements and failures, your hopes and dreams for the future. Your number connects you only to your current status as someone who requires institutional management because you have failed at the basic task of supporting yourself in the outside world. When you begin to respond more readily to your number than to your name, You know that the workhouse is succeeding in its mission of reshaping your identity according to its institutional needs. The rule of silence pervades every aspect of workhouse life, creating an atmosphere of enforced isolation that prevents the formation of relationships or the sharing of experiences that might provide emotional support during difficult times. You are permitted to speak only when directly addressed by a member of the staff, and only to provide information or acknowledgement that has been specifically requested. Casual conversation with other residents is strictly forbidden, as are expressions of opinion, complaints about treatment or conditions, and any form of communication that might be interpreted as planning or organizing resistance to institutional policies. This enforced silence serves multiple purposes within the workhouse system. It prevents the formation of social bonds that might provide emotional support and make institutional life more tolerable. It eliminates opportunities for residents to share information about their experiences, compare treatment, or develop collective responses to problematic conditions. It reduces the overall noise level in dormitories and work areas, making it easier for staff to detect unauthorized activities or conversations. Most importantly, it reinforces the fundamental power relationship between staff and residents by establishing that communication is a privilege controlled by the institution rather than a basic human right. The psychological effects of enforced silence are profound and cumulative. Human beings are fundamentally social creatures who rely on communication to process experiences, maintain emotional equilibrium, and preserve their sense of individual identity. When communication is severely restricted, people often experience increased anxiety, depression, and confusion about their circumstances and their place in the world. The workhouse silence policy is designed to produce exactly these psychological states, because people who are anxious, depressed, and confused are generally more compliant and less likely to challenge institutional authority or demand better treatment. Learning to live without casual conversation requires developing new strategies for managing the emotional and intellectual needs that communication normally fulfills. Some residents learn to conduct elaborate internal monologues, carrying on imaginary conversations with family members, friends, or even fictional characters as a way of maintaining their capacity for social interaction. Others develop almost ritualistic relationships with inanimate objects, treating their few possessions or work tools as though they were capable of providing the companionship that has been denied through contact with other human beings. The enforcement of silence rules requires constant vigilance from both staff and residents, creating an atmosphere of mutual surveillance that further undermines any possibility of developing trust or solidarity within the institutional community. Staff members are trained to listen for unauthorized conversations and to impose penalties for violations of the silence policy. Residents quickly learn that any attempt at communication carries the risk of punishment not only for themselves, but potentially for anyone who might be perceived as participating in or encouraging the forbidden interaction. Penalties for speaking without permission range from loss of food privileges to assignment to particularly unpleasant work details to periods of solitary confinement in spaces that are already designed to minimize human contact and sensory stimulation. The threat of these punishments is usually sufficient to maintain compliance with the silence policy, but the knowledge that any moment might bring detection and punishment creates a state of constant tension that makes the already difficult conditions of workhouse life even more stressful and psychologically demanding. The combination of physical discomfort from ill-fitting, uncomfortable clothing and psychological stress from social isolation and loss of individual identity creates a state of comprehensive misery that affects every aspect of daily existence. You cannot escape the constant irritation of rough fabric against your skin, the embarrassment of wearing obviously degraded clothing, or the loneliness of being unable to share your experiences with other people who might understand what you are going through. These conditions are not accidental byproducts of institutional efficiency or economic necessity. They are carefully designed elements of a system intended to make poverty so unpleasant that people will do almost anything to escape it. The workhouse uniform and rules work together to create a total environment that reshapes not only your daily behavior, but your fundamental understanding of your own worth and place in society. By the end of your first week, you have learned that your comfort, dignity, and individual preferences are not simply low priorities within the institutional system. They are actively discouraged as obstacles to the efficient operation of an institution designed to process large numbers of people according to standardized procedures that prioritize compliance over humanity. Your gray uniform becomes more than clothing. It becomes a second skin that carries the smell, stains, and discomfort of institutional life wherever you go. Your number becomes more than identification. It becomes the primary way you understand yourself in relation to the world around you. The silence that surrounds you becomes more than a rule. It becomes a barrier that separates you from the human connections that might make even the most difficult circumstances bearable. Each day that passes in your grey uniform, responding to your number, moving through your routines in enforced silence, takes you further away from the person you were when you first approached the workhouse doors. The institution is succeeding in its mission of transforming you from an individual with rights and dignity into a manageable unit of institutional inventory. The process is gradual enough that you might not notice it happening, but comprehensive enough that by the time you do notice, the transformation has already progressed too far to reverse easily. Chapter 3. The first night inside the dormitory stretches before you in the dim gaslight, a long rectangular room that might have once served as a warehouse or storage facility before being converted to house the institution's human inventory. The ceiling rises high above your head, creating an atmosphere that feels both cavernous and oppressive, as though the space itself is designed to make you feel small and insignificant. Heavy wooden beams support the roof structure, their dark surfaces stained by decades of smoke from oil lamps and gas fixtures, creating shadows that seem to shift and move in the flickering light. The walls are painted in the same institutional pale green that you encountered in other parts of the building, a color that manages to be both harsh and dreary simultaneously, offering neither comfort nor beauty to anyone who must spend their nights surrounded by it. Your assigned bed is one of 40 identical wooden frames arranged in precise rows throughout the dormitory, each positioned exactly the same distance from its neighbors, creating a geometric pattern that prioritizes efficient use of space over any consideration of privacy or personal comfort. The uniformity of the arrangement serves to reinforce the institutional philosophy that individual preferences and needs are secondary to administrative convenience and systematic organization. Each bed frame has been constructed from the cheapest available materials, rough pine boards, that have been assembled with minimal attention to smoothness or finish, leaving surfaces that catch on clothing and bedding, creating splinters that will work their way into your skin during the restless movements of sleep. The mattress that has been provided for your use consists of a canvas bag filled with straw that has been pressed into service long past its optimal period of usefulness. The straw has been compressed by countless previous occupants into a thin, lumpy mass that provides minimal cushioning between your body and the hard wooden slats of the bed frame. When you lie down for the first time, you can feel each individual board pressing against your spine, hips, and shoulders, creating pressure points that will ache throughout the night and leave you stiff and sore in the morning. The straw inside the mattress has begun to break down into smaller fragments that work their way through the canvas covering, creating a constant shower of tiny pieces that irritate your skin and fill the air around your bed with dust that makes breathing difficult. The canvas covering of the mattress has been patched multiple times with squares of fabric that do not match the original material, creating a patchwork appearance that tells the story of its long service to the institution. Some patches have been sewn on with thread that is already beginning to fail, allowing the edges to curl and separate, creating openings through which more straw can escape. The overall effect is of a piece of bedding that has been maintained just barely above the level of complete failure, providing the minimum level of functionality necessary to serve its institutional purpose, while offering no consideration for the comfort or dignity of the person who must sleep on it. The single blanket that accompanies your mattress has been woven from wool that shares the same rough, scratchy characteristics as your uniform, creating a covering that provides minimal warmth while maximizing discomfort. The blanket has been sized to cover the mattress with little extra material, meaning that any attempt to pull it up to cover your shoulders will leave your feet exposed, while covering your feet will leave your upper body vulnerable to the cold air that circulates constantly through the poorly heated dormitory. The edges of the blanket have been bound with strips of fabric that have begun to fray and separate, creating loose threads that catch on your clothing and skin, adding another layer of irritation to an already uncomfortable sleeping arrangement. The wool of the blanket has been processed using the same harsh chemicals and mechanical treatments as your uniform, leaving it with a texture that seems designed to remind you constantly of your reduced circumstances. After a few hours of contact with your skin, the wool begins to cause the same rashes and irritation that you experience from your clothing, creating red, itchy patches that make sleep even more difficult to achieve. The blanket retains odors from previous users, creating a musty smell that combines the sense of unwashed bodies, institutional soap, and the general staleness that accumulates in spaces where proper ventilation is considered an unnecessary luxury. The presence of rats in the dormitory becomes apparent before you have been lying in your bed for more than a few minutes. The sound of their movement through the walls and under the floorboards creates a constant background noise that ranges from barely audible scratching to more obvious scurrying sounds when they move between hiding places in search of food or more comfortable nesting locations. The rats have learned to associate the dormitory with opportunities for foraging, as residents sometimes manage to smuggle small amounts of food from the dining hall, and the straw mattresses provide excellent nesting material for rodents that have adapted to institutional life as successfully as any human inhabitant. Occasionally, you catch glimpses of the rats as they move along the walls or dart between bed frames, their dark forms creating movement in your peripheral vision that adds to the sense of unease that accompanies your first night in the workhouse. The rats show little fear of human presence, having learned that the dormitory residents pose no threat to their activities, and may even provide inadvertent assistance in the form of dropped food crumbs or bedding materials that can be appropriated for nest construction. Their boldness is both disturbing and somehow appropriate to the institutional environment, where the boundaries between human and animal living conditions have been deliberately blurred by policies that prioritize efficiency over dignity. The institutional response to the rat problem is characteristic of the workhouse approach to most difficulties faced by residents. The presence of rodents is acknowledged but not considered sufficiently problematic to warrant significant expenditure of resources for elimination or control. Residents are expected to adapt to sharing their living space with rats, just as they are expected to adapt to all other aspects of institutional life that would be considered unacceptable in normal circumstances. The rats become part of the environment that you must learn to navigate. Another element of institutional life that serves to reinforce your reduced status and limited rights as someone who depends on charitable assistance for survival. The sounds of the dormitory create a complex auditory landscape that makes peaceful sleep nearly impossible for someone accustomed to the relative quiet of private accommodations. The most prominent sounds are those produced by your fellow residents, whose various forms of nighttime breathing create a symphony of human distress that fills the air from the moment the lights are extinguished until they are lit again in the morning. Some residents snore with the deep, rattling sounds that suggest respiratory problems that have not received proper medical attention, while others produce lighter, more frequent sounds that indicate the kind of restless sleep that comes from chronic anxiety and physical discomfort. The crying that occurs in the dormitory each night represents the emotional outlet that has been denied to residents during their waking hours, when the institutional rules require silence and compliance regardless of personal feelings or circumstances. In the darkness, with the staff members making only occasional rounds to ensure that everyone remains in their assigned beds, some residents allow themselves the luxury of expressing grief, fear, and despair that must be suppressed during daylight hours. The crying ranges from quiet weeping that is barely audible above the general background noise to more intense sobbing that can wake other residents and create a ripple effect of emotional distress throughout the dormitory. The institutional response to nighttime crying is generally one of tolerance, as long as it does not become so disruptive as to interfere with the sleep of large numbers of residents or require intervention from staff members who prefer to minimize their contact with the emotional needs of the people under their supervision. Residents quickly learn that while some expression of distress is acceptable during sleeping hours, excessive emotional display can result in punishment or reassignment to less desirable accommodations, so most people learn to moderate their expressions of grief and despair to avoid drawing unwanted attention from the institutional authorities. The silence that exists between the various sounds of the dormitory is not the peaceful quiet that might provide rest and restoration, but rather a tense, watchful silence that reflects the constant awareness that any noise might bring unwanted attention from staff members or fellow residents. This silence is filled with the suppressed sounds of people trying to move quietly in their beds, to cough or clear their throats without disturbing others, to shift position in search of more comfortable arrangements without creating the kind of disturbance that might be interpreted as disruptive behavior. The silence becomes another source of stress rather than a source of comfort, requiring constant vigilance and self-control that makes true relaxation impossible. The arrangement of beds in the dormitory ensures that you are never more than a few feet away from other residents, creating an environment where privacy is completely impossible and personal space is limited to the narrow area occupied by your bed and the small amount of floor space immediately adjacent to it. The person in the bed next to yours becomes an unwilling intimate, someone whose sleeping habits, health problems, and emotional responses to institutional life become as familiar to you as your own. You learn to recognize the particular patterns of breathing, movement, and nighttime distress that characterize each of your immediate neighbors, creating relationships based on unwanted intimacy rather than mutual choice or compatibility. The lack of privacy extends beyond the simple fact of sleeping in close proximity to strangers. The dormitory arrangement makes it impossible to have any private thoughts or moments of solitude, as any sound or movement is immediately apparent to everyone within several beds of your location. Personal hygiene becomes a public activity, as the limited washing facilities require you to perform intimate tasks in full view of other residents. Changing clothes, when such changes are possible, must be accomplished with the awareness that your body is visible to anyone who happens to be looking in your direction, eliminating any possibility of maintaining the kind of personal dignity that most people consider essential to their sense of self-worth. The presence of sickness in the dormitory is a constant source of anxiety that affects everyone who must sleep in the crowded, poorly ventilated space. Residents bring with them whatever illnesses they were suffering from when they entered the workhouse, and these conditions are often exacerbated by the stress, poor nutrition, and unsanitary conditions that characterize institutional life. Respiratory illnesses spread quickly in the confined space, creating cycles of infection that move through the dormitory population like waves, leaving few residents unaffected by the various forms of contagion that thrive in the institutional environment. The institutional medical response to sickness in the dormitory is minimal and often ineffective, as the workhouse infirmary is understaffed and undersupplied, designed to provide only the most basic care for residents who become so ill that they cannot perform their assigned work duties. Minor illnesses are expected to be endured without complaint or special treatment, while more serious conditions may receive attention only after they have progressed to the point where they threaten the health of other residents or the efficient operation of the institution. The result is that sickness becomes another element of dormitory life that residents must learn to navigate without institutional support, developing their own informal systems of care and assistance that operate outside the official channels of medical attention. The dreams that come during the brief periods when sleep is possible are often dominated by memories of food, specifically the kinds of meals that were available in your previous life, but which have become impossible luxuries under the institutional feeding system. Your sleeping mind revisits the experience of eating fresh bread with butter, meat that has been cooked with care and seasoning, vegetables that retain their natural flavors and textures, and sweets that provide not only nutrition, but also the psychological satisfaction that comes from consuming something that has been prepared primarily for pleasure rather than mere sustenance. These food dreams are both a source of comfort and a form of psychological torture, as they provide temporary relief from the monotony and deprivation of institutional life, while simultaneously highlighting the extent to which your circumstances have deteriorated. You wake from dreams of abundant meals to face the reality of watery gruel and stale bread, creating a daily cycle of hope and disappointment that adds to the overall psychological burden of workhouse life. The dreams serve as a reminder of what you have lost and what you are unlikely to regain as long as you remain dependent on institutional charity for survival. The contrast between the dream world, where food is available and pleasurable, and the waking world, where nutrition is rationed and unappetizing, becomes one of the most psychologically difficult aspects of adapting to workhouse life. Your sleeping mind refuses to accept the limitations of your current circumstances, continuing to imagine scenarios where choice and abundance are possible, while your waking hours are filled with the constant awareness that such possibilities have been removed from your life for the foreseeable future. The dreams become a form of mental rebellion against the institutional control over your daily existence, but they also serve to make that control more painful by highlighting what you have been forced to surrender. The physical discomfort of your sleeping arrangements combines with the psychological stress of your situation to create a state of chronic exhaustion that affects every aspect of your daily functioning. The straw mattress and thin blanket provide insufficient comfort to allow for deep, restorative sleep, while the noise, crowding, and emotional distress of the dormitory environment create constant interruptions to whatever rest you might otherwise achieve. You find yourself caught in a cycle where poor sleep makes it more difficult to cope with the demands of institutional life, while the stress of institutional life makes it more difficult to achieve the kind of sleep that might provide relief from those demands. The morning always comes too soon, announced by the harsh sound of the bell that signals the end of the night's rest period and the beginning of another day of institutional routine. The bell rings while the dormitory is still dark, requiring you to rise and prepare for the day's activities without the benefit of natural light or adequate time for the gradual awakening that might ease the transition from sleep to wakefulness. The sound of 40 people simultaneously rising from their beds, gathering their few possessions, and preparing to move to the next phase of their daily routine creates a chaos of sound and movement that makes any possibility of peaceful awakening impossible. Your first night in the workhouse dormitory serves as an introduction to the reality that institutional life involves the systematic elimination of almost everything that makes existence comfortable or dignifying. The sleeping arrangements are designed not to provide rest and restoration, but to deliver the minimum level of accommodation necessary to maintain life, while ensuring that the experience remains sufficiently unpleasant to discourage long-term residents. The message is clear. This is not a place where you are meant to feel at home or comfortable, but rather a place where you are meant to survive until you can find some way to return to the outside world and support yourself without institutional assistance. As you lie in the darkness of your first night, listening to the sounds of human distress that surround you, feeling the discomfort of inadequate bedding and the anxiety of sleeping among strangers, you begin to understand that surviving in the workhouse requires more than simply enduring physical hardship. It requires accepting a fundamental redefinition of your expectations about what constitutes acceptable living conditions, personal privacy, and individual dignity. The dormitory is not just a place to sleep, but a laboratory where the institution conducts its experiments in social control and human management, testing the limits of what people will accept when they have no other choices available to them. Chapter 4. Morning begins with bells. The bell rings at 5 o'clock in the morning, with a harshness that seems designed to assault the nervous system rather than simply announce the beginning of the day. The sound cuts through the darkness of the dormitory like a blade, instantly transforming the relative peace of sleeping hours into the urgent demands of institutional routine. There is no gradual awakening in the workhouse, no gentle transition from the world of dreams to the world of daily responsibilities. The bell demands immediate response, and the consequences of failing to respond quickly enough are made clear through the behavior of residents who have learned through experience that hesitation results in punishment that makes an already difficult day considerably worse. The sound of the bell reverberates through the thick stone walls of the building, creating echoes that seem to multiply and intensify as they bounce between the narrow corridors and high ceilings of the institutional architecture. The acoustics of the workhouse have been shaped by practical considerations rather than comfort, resulting in spaces where sounds carry farther and last longer than they would in buildings designed for human habitation rather than human management. The bell's message penetrates every corner of the dormitory, ensuring that no resident can claim ignorance of the call to rise, while simultaneously serving as a reminder that privacy and personal space are luxuries that have no place in the institutional environment. Within moments of the bell's first toll, the dormitory transforms from a place of relative quiet into a scene of controlled chaos, as 40 residents simultaneously begin the process of preparing themselves for another day of institutional life. The sounds of people rising from straw mattresses, gathering their few possessions, and attempting to make themselves presentable create a symphony of human activity that would be almost comforting if it were not accompanied by the underlying tension that characterizes all aspects of workhouse routine. Every movement is performed with the awareness that time is limited and that failure to complete the morning preparations within the allotted period will result in punishment that affects not only the individual but potentially the entire dormitory population. The institutional philosophy regarding punctuality reflects the broader workhouse approach to human behavior and social control. Lateness is not viewed as a minor inconvenience or a personal failing that can be addressed through gentle correction. It is treated as a form of rebellion against institutional authority that must be suppressed through immediate and memorable consequences. The residents who have survived their first weeks in the workhouse have learned that being late for any scheduled activity results in punishment that is designed not only to correct the immediate problem, but to serve as a warning to others who might be tempted to test the boundaries of institutional tolerance. The absence of excuses for lateness creates an environment where personal circumstances, health problems, and individual needs become irrelevant to the institutional expectation of compliance. If you are ill, you are still expected to rise at 5 o'clock and participate in the morning routine. If you have been kept awake during the night by the distress of other residents, you are still expected to be ready for the day's activities when the bell rings. If your advanced age or physical limitations make it difficult to move quickly, you are still expected to keep pace with residents who are younger and stronger. The institutional response to individual differences is not accommodation, but rather the expectation that everyone will adapt to the same standard, regardless of their personal circumstances. The consequences of being late are swift and predictable, designed to reinforce the importance of institutional schedules while demonstrating to other residents the futility of challenging workhouse authority. Late residents may find their breakfast portions reduced or eliminated entirely, creating a direct connection between compliance and nutrition that ensures the lesson is both immediate and memorable. They may be assigned to particularly unpleasant work details that serve no productive purpose beyond punishment, or they may be subjected to public humiliation in front of other residents as a way of reinforcing the social hierarchy that places institutional authority above individual dignity. The washing facilities available for morning hygiene consist of a long wooden trough that runs along one wall of a room adjacent to the dormitory, supplied with cold water that is replaced perhaps once each day, though sometimes less frequently if the staff responsible for maintenance has been assigned to other duties. The water in the trough quickly becomes cloudy and unpleasant as it is used by dozens of residents, each of whom contributes their own dirt, sweat, and other bodily substances to what was originally intended to be a shared cleaning resource. By the time the last residents reach the washing station, the water bears little resemblance to anything that might be considered suitable for personal hygiene, having been transformed into a murky liquid that may actually leave users dirtier than they were before attempting to wash. The soap provided for washing purposes has been manufactured using the cheapest available ingredients and methods, resulting in a product that is harsh enough to remove some types of dirt and organic matter, but caustic enough to cause significant irritation to skin that is already sensitive from poor nutrition and constant contact with rough clothing. The soap burns eyes and mucous membranes, creating a stinging sensation that makes thorough washing painful and difficult to accomplish. Many residents learn to use the soap sparingly, accepting a lower level of cleanliness in exchange for avoiding the discomfort that comes from more thorough washing with the institutional cleaning product. The limited time allocated for morning washing creates an additional source of stress that transforms what should be a routine personal care activity into a competitive struggle for access to inadequate resources. With 40 residents sharing a single washing station, each person has perhaps 2 or 3 minutes to complete their entire morning hygiene routine. This time constraint makes it impossible to achieve the kind of thorough cleanliness that might provide some relief from the physical discomforts of institutional life, while simultaneously creating anxiety about completing the required tasks within the allotted time frame. The towels provided for drying are made from the same coarse materials as other workhouse textiles, creating rectangles of rough fabric that are more effective at abrading skin than at absorbing moisture. These towels are shared among all residents, passed from person to person throughout the washing period, accumulating dirt, soap residue, and moisture from dozens of users. By the time you have access to a towel, it has already been used by most of the other residents in your dormitory, transforming what should be the final step in achieving cleanliness into an activity that may actually transfer dirt and germs from previous users to your newly washed skin. The breakfast served in the workhouse dining hall represents the institutional approach to nutrition, which prioritizes economy and efficiency over taste, variety, or adequate nourishment. The primary component of the morning meal is porridge made from oats that have been boiled in water until they achieve a consistency that is somehow both thin and lumpy simultaneously. The porridge contains no milk, butter, sugar, or other ingredients that might make it palatable or nutritionally complete, resulting in a grey, watery substance that provides minimal sustenance while requiring considerable effort to consume without gagging on the texture and flavour. Of the porridge reflects the institutional philosophy that food should provide just enough nutrition to maintain life and working capacity without offering any pleasure or satisfaction that might make institutional life comfortable enough to be preferable to the struggles of independent survival. The porridge is served at a temperature that is neither hot enough to be comforting nor cool enough to be refreshing, having been allowed to sit in serving containers for extended periods while residents are processed through the breakfast routine according to their assigned schedules and dormitory arrangements. The portion size of the porridge is calculated with mathematical precision to provide the minimum number of calories necessary to fuel a day of institutional labor without offering any surplus that might contribute to physical comfort or energy reserves. Each resident receives exactly the same amount regardless of their size, age, physical condition, or the demands of their assigned work duties. A small elderly woman receives the same portion as a large young man who will spend his day performing heavy physical labor, reflecting the institutional belief that individual needs are less important than administrative simplicity and cost control. The utensils provided for consuming the morning meal consist of wooden spoons that have been carved from cheap materials and subjected to years of institutional use without adequate maintenance or replacement. The spoons are often cracked, splintered, or otherwise damaged in ways that make eating difficult and potentially dangerous, as sharp edges and rough surfaces can cause cuts and splinters in the mouth and hands. The institutional response to damaged utensils is typically to continue using them until they become completely unusable, prioritizing economy over the safety and comfort of the residents who must use them for daily nutrition. The dining hall where breakfast is consumed has been designed according to the same principles that govern all other aspects of workhouse architecture, prioritizing efficient processing of large numbers of people over any consideration of comfort or dignity. Long wooden tables and benches are arranged in precise rows that allow maximum occupancy while minimizing the amount of space required for seating. The benches are uncomfortable and placed at heights that do not accommodate the range of human body sizes and physical conditions represented among the resident population, resulting in seating arrangements that cause back pain, leg cramps, and other forms of physical discomfort that add to the challenges of consuming an already unappetizing meal. The institutional rules governing behavior during meals are designed to maintain order and control while eliminating any possibility that the shared experience of eating might create opportunities for social interaction or mutual support among residents. Talking is strictly forbidden during meals, transforming what should be a social activity into a solitary experience that must be completed in silence under the watchful supervision of staff members who are trained to detect and punish any violation of the established procedures. The silence policy ensures that residents cannot share information about institutional conditions, compare their treatment, or develop the kind of relationships that might provide emotional support during difficult times. The smell that permeates every surface of the workhouse represents a complex mixture of institutional odors that combine to create an olfactory environment that is both distinctive and oppressive. The dominant components of this institutional smell include the harsh soap used for cleaning, which leaves a chemical residue that clings to walls, floors, and fabrics long after the cleaning process has been completed. This soap smell is sharp and artificial, creating an odor that announces the institutional nature of the environment, while simultaneously suggesting the kind of aggressive cleaning that prioritizes disinfection over comfort or pleasantness. The aroma of boiled cabbage contributes another layer to the institutional smell, representing the vegetable that appears most frequently in workhouse meals due to its low cost, long storage life, and ability to provide minimal nutrition with maximum economy. The cabbage is typically boiled until it loses most of its nutritional value and all of its natural flavor, creating a cooking process that fills the air with the smell of overcooked vegetables that have been transformed from food into mere fuel for institutional purposes. This cabbage smell penetrates every corner of the building, becoming so pervasive that residents eventually stop noticing it consciously, while their bodies continue to associate the odor with the experience of institutional life. The combination of soap and cabbage smells is joined by other institutional odors that reflect the realities of housing large numbers of people in conditions that prioritize economy over hygiene. Unwashed bodies, inadequately cleaned clothing, and poor ventilation contribute to an overall atmosphere that is both stale and oppressive, creating an environment where fresh air and pleasant odors become distant memories rather than daily experiences. These smells become embedded in the fabric of clothing, the fibers of bedding, and even the hair and skin of residents, creating a permanent olfactory reminder of institutional life that cannot be easily removed or escaped. The institutional response to the smell problem is characteristic of the workhouse approach to most issues that affect resident comfort and dignity. The odors are acknowledged as an inevitable consequence of housing large numbers of poor people in economical conditions, rather than as a problem that could be addressed through improved ventilation, more frequent cleaning, or better quality food preparation. Residents are expected to adapt to the institutional smell, just as they are expected to adapt to all other aspects of workhouse life that would be considered unacceptable in normal circumstances. The psychological impact of living in an environment that smells constantly of institutional cleaning products and overcooked vegetables extends beyond simple sensory discomfort. Smells have a powerful connection to memory and emotion, and the institutional odors of the workhouse serve as constant reminders of reduced circumstances and lost dignity. The inability to escape these smells, even temporarily, creates a sense of being trapped in an environment that is fundamentally different from the world of choice and comfort that residents remember from their previous lives. The morning routine of rising at 5 o'clock, washing with cold water and harsh soap, and consuming thin porridge in silence establishes the pattern that will govern every aspect of institutional life. Each element of the routine has been designed to reinforce the fundamental message that individual preferences, comfort, and dignity are luxuries that have no place in an institution designed to provide charity to those who have failed at the basic task of supporting themselves. The routine creates a daily reminder that survival in the workhouse requires accepting conditions that most people would consider unacceptable, while simultaneously demonstrating that such acceptance is possible when no other options are available. The cumulative effect of the morning routine is to begin each day with a series of experiences that systematically undermine self-respect and individual agency. Rising to the harsh sound of a bell eliminates the possibility of natural awakening according to personal rhythms. Washing with inadequate facilities and harsh soap prevents the achievement of genuine cleanliness while creating physical discomfort. Consuming unpalatable food in enforced silence transforms the basic human need for nutrition into an ordeal that must be endured rather than an activity that might provide pleasure or satisfaction. By the time breakfast is finished and the morning routine is completed, residents have been reminded multiple times that their individual needs and preferences are irrelevant to institutional operations. They have been physically uncomfortable, inadequately nourished, and socially isolated, creating a state of vulnerability that makes them more likely to comply with institutional demands and less likely to challenge the conditions that characterize their daily existence. The morning routine serves as both a practical necessity for managing large numbers of people and a psychological tool for maintaining the kind of control that makes institutional life possible. The transition from the morning routine to the day's work assignments represents another opportunity for the institution to demonstrate its complete authority over resident schedules and activities. There is no time for rest, reflection, or personal activities between the completion of breakfast and the beginning of work duties. Residents move directly from the dining hall to their assigned work locations, carrying with them the physical discomfort of inadequate washing, the unsatisfied hunger that results from insufficient nutrition, and the psychological stress that comes from beginning each day with a series of unpleasant experiences that serve no purpose beyond demonstrating institutional control over every aspect of daily life. Chapter 5. Men, Women, and Children, all separated. The heavy wooden doors of the workhouse close behind you with a dull thud that echoes through the stone corridors, but this sound, resonating through the cold air, marks more than just your entry into this institution. It marks the beginning of a separation so complete, so methodical, that it will reshape the very foundation of what you understand about family bonds. The Victorian workhouse was designed not merely to house the poor, but to systematically dismantle the family unit, believing that such separation would discourage people from seeking relief and would instill proper discipline through isolation. As you stand in that entrance hall, still clutching whatever meager possessions you've managed to bring with you, a workhouse official approaches with a ledger in hand and keys jangling from his belt. His voice is neither cruel nor kind, simply mechanical, as he explains what will happen next. Your family, if you have arrived together, will be divided according to the strict classifications that govern every aspect of workhouse life. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 mandated this separation, viewing the natural bonds between family members as potentially corrupting influences that might soften the harsh discipline the workhouse was meant to provide. The classification system operates with bureaucratic precision. Men over the age of 13 are directed to one section of the building, women to another, and children to yet another area entirely. But the separations go deeper than these broad categories. Elderly men and women are kept apart from younger adults. Pregnant women and nursing mothers occupy their own wards. Children are further divided by age and gender, with boys and girls over the age of 7 sleeping in different dormitories. Even infants, those under 2 years of age, are kept with their mothers only until they can be weaned, after which they too join the ranks of the separated. You watch as families around you begin to fracture. A mother holds her 5-year-old daughter close, whispering reassurances that ring hollow in the echoing hall. The child's eyes are wide with confusion, not yet understanding why her father is being led away through a different door, why her older brother must go in yet another direction. The workhouse master's assistant, a thin woman with severe features and a ring of keys at her waist, approaches the mother with gentle but firm insistence. The little girl must come with her now. The schoolroom awaits, where she will learn to read and write and sew, where she will be trained for domestic service that might one day lift her from the poverty that brought her family to this place. The sound that emerges from that small child as she is led away is not a scream or a wail, but something worse. It is a keening cry, a sound of loss so profound that it seems to seep into the very stones of the building, and you realize with a chill that has nothing to do with the cold air of the workhouse that this sound is familiar here. The walls have absorbed countless such cries over the years, The grief of children separated from parents, of husbands divided from wives, of families torn apart by regulations written by men who had never known such poverty themselves. Your own family members, if you have them with you, are processed with the same methodical efficiency. If you are a father, you watch your wife disappear through one doorway, while your children are led through another. The workhouse officials assure you that this separation is temporary, that families are permitted to see each other during designated times, but these reassurances feel distant and cold. The designated times, you learn, are brief and infrequent. Sunday afternoons might offer an hour or two of supervised visitation in a common room, where conversation is monitored and physical affection discouraged. The children's quarters occupy an entire wing of the workhouse, a maze of dormitories, schoolrooms and workshops designed to house and train the young inmates. The youngest children, those between the ages of 2 and 7, spend their days in nursery rooms under the care of pauper women who have been assigned this duty. These caretakers, themselves inmates of the workhouse, do their best to provide some measure of comfort and routine. But they are not the children's mothers. They cannot offer the specific love and attention that each child craves. Instead, they manage groups of 20 or 30 children at a time, maintaining order and basic care while the children slowly adapt to their new reality. The older children, those above 7 years of age, follow a strict routine of education and labor. The boys learn reading, writing, and arithmetic for a few hours each day, but the majority of their time is spent in workshops learning trades that might make them self-sufficient when they reach adulthood. They work with wood and metal, learning carpentry and basic metalworking skills. They tend to the workhouse gardens, learning agricultural techniques that might serve them as farm laborers. The work is not merely educational but productive. The items they create, the food they grow, the services they provide, all contribute to the workhouse's operations and help reduce its costs. The girls follow a parallel but different path. Their education covers the same basic subjects, but their labor training focuses primarily on domestic skills. They work in the workhouse laundries, learning to wash and mend clothes and linens. They spend hours in the kitchens, preparing the simple meals that feed hundreds of inmates daily. They learn needlework and basic nursing skills, preparing them for lives as domestic servants or factory workers. Like the boys, their labor contributes directly to the workhouse's functioning, but their training also reinforces the Victorian belief that women's proper sphere was domestic, that their highest calling was to serve others in homes and institutions. The physical separation of families extends beyond mere housing arrangements. The workhouse is designed with this separation in mind, featuring distinct wings and sections that rarely intersect. The men's quarters typically occupy one side of the building, with workshops, dormitories and dining areas arranged to keep male inmates contained within their designated space. The women's quarters mirror this arrangement on the opposite side, creating a parallel world where wives and mothers live their daily lives without any contact with their husbands and sons. Between these adult sections lies the children's area, strategically placed so that parents might occasionally catch glimpses of their offspring across courtyards or through windows, but rarely close enough for conversation or comfort. This placement is both practical and psychological. The sight of their children reminds parents of what they have lost through their poverty, serving as a constant motivation to reform their circumstances. Yet the distance maintained between parent and child prevents the kind of regular interaction that might soften the harsh lessons the workhouse aims to teach. The daily routines within each section are carefully structured to minimize opportunities for family contact. Men wake at 5 in the morning and immediately begin their assigned labor, whether in the stone yard breaking rocks, in workshops making shoes or clothing, or in the gardens tending vegetables. Women follow a parallel schedule, rising at the same early hour to begin work in the laundries, kitchens, or sewing rooms. Children have their own distinct timetable, with education and work periods arranged to keep them occupied and separated from their parents throughout the day. Meals are taken separately within each section, with men dining in their own hall, women in theirs, and children eating in age-appropriate groups. Even when families entered the workhouse together, they experienced their hunger, their satisfaction, their simple daily sustenance as isolated individuals rather than as connected family units. The shared meal, that most basic form of family gathering, becomes a memory rather than a daily reality. The sleeping arrangements reinforce this separation throughout the night hours. Men's dormitories house dozens of beds arranged in long rows, with each man allocated a narrow space barely wide enough for sleep. Women's dormitories follow the same pattern, with mothers sleeping among strangers rather than beside their husbands or children. Children's dormitories are segregated by both age and gender, so that brothers and sisters over 7 years old rarely see each other even in sleep. These sleeping quarters are not merely separate, but deliberately austere. The beds consist of wooden frames supporting thin straw mattresses, with rough blankets providing minimal warmth. Privacy is virtually non-existent, with dozens of people sharing each dormitory space. The sounds of sleep surround you constantly, the breathing and movement of strangers, the occasional cry of someone lost in dreams of the life they left behind, the early morning stirrings as another day of separation begins. Within the women's quarters, mothers adapt to their new reality with varying degrees of success. Some focus intensely on their assigned work, throwing themselves into laundry duties or kitchen tasks as a way of passing time and avoiding thoughts of their separated children. Others spend their few free moments stationed at windows, hoping for glimpses of their sons and daughters in the courtyards below. The lucky ones might catch sight of a familiar small figure crossing between buildings. But even these brief sightings are often too distant to offer real comfort. The emotional toll of this separation manifests in different ways among the women. Some become withdrawn and silent, moving through their daily routines like sleepwalkers. Others form substitute family bonds with fellow inmates, creating networks of mutual support and care that help fill the void left by their biological families. These friendships often become lifelines, providing emotional sustenance when the formal structures of the workhouse offer only cold efficiency. In the men's quarters, fathers cope with separation through similar strategies. The physical labor demanded of male inmates provides an outlet for frustration and grief, but it also serves as a distraction from thoughts of separated families. Men work side by side, breaking stones or digging ditches, their conversations often turning to memories of life outside the workhouse walls and plans for eventual reunion with their families. Some men become mentors to younger inmates, offering advice and guidance that substitute for the paternal relationships they cannot maintain with their own sons. The children's experience of separation evolves differently depending on their age and understanding. Very young children often cry frequently during their first weeks in the workhouse, calling for parents who cannot come to comfort them. The pauper women assigned to care for them do their best to provide soothing, but they cannot replace the specific love and attention that each child has lost. Over time, most children adapt to their new circumstances, but this adaptation often comes at the cost of emotional numbing, a protective mechanism that helps them survive, but may affect their ability to form close relationships in the future. Older children, particularly those approaching adolescence, sometimes struggle with anger and resentment over their situation. They understand more clearly what has been taken from them and may act out through small rebellions against workhouse rules. These behaviors are typically met with swift punishment, adding another layer of hardship to their already difficult circumstances. Yet some older children also demonstrate remarkable resilience, taking on protective roles toward younger inmates and forming strong bonds with their peers that help compensate for lost family connections. The educational programs provided for children, while basic, offer some measure of hope and structure. Teachers, usually educated paupers or occasionally outsiders hired for their skills, work with limited resources to provide instruction in reading, writing, and arithmetic. These lessons take place in sparse classrooms with few books and minimal supplies, but they represent one of the few aspects of workhouse life focused on improving inmates' future prospects, rather than simply managing their present circumstances. The quality of education varies significantly depending on the resources and commitment of individual workhouses. Some institutions maintain reasonably effective schools that provide children with genuine learning opportunities. Others offer only the most basic instruction, focusing more on maintaining order than on actual education. In all cases, however, education takes second place to labor, with children spending far more time working than learning. For children with particular aptitudes or interests, the workhouse system offers little accommodation. A child who shows artistic talent or musical ability will still be directed toward practical trades or domestic service. Individual dreams and aspirations are viewed as luxuries that the poor cannot afford. The system aims to produce useful workers rather than fulfilled individuals, and this philosophy shapes every aspect of children's daily experiences. The weekly visiting periods, when families are permitted brief reunions, become focal points of intense anticipation and often disappointment. These visits typically last 1 or 2 hours on Sunday afternoons, taking place in common rooms under the watchful eyes of workhouse officials. Physical contact is discouraged, with families expected to maintain proper distance and decorum throughout their time together. Conversation is monitored, with any discussions deemed inappropriate or potentially disruptive quickly curtailed. During these precious visiting hours, families struggle to maintain connections across the gulf of their daily separation. Parents try to offer comfort and guidance to children they barely see, while children attempt to share their experiences and needs with parents who cannot provide immediate help or comfort. The artificial nature of these interactions, conducted under supervision and time constraints, often makes genuine communication difficult. Some families use their visiting time to plan for the future, discussing strategies for leaving the workhouse and reuniting permanently. Others focus on the present, sharing small news and offering mutual encouragement. Many visits are marked by tears and difficult partings, as family members must return to their separate quarters, knowing that another week will pass before they can meet again. The architectural design of the workhouse reinforces family separation through its physical layout. Corridors are arranged to prevent casual encounters between different sections of inmates. Windows in family quarters often face inward toward courtyards, rather than outward toward the surrounding community, limiting inmates' connection to the outside world while also preventing easy visual contact between separated family members. The courtyards themselves are divided by high walls and fences, creating separate outdoor spaces for different categories of inmates. Men exercise and take their limited recreation in one area, women in another, and children in yet another space. Even when weather permits outdoor activities, families remain divided by physical barriers that make communication impossible. These design elements were not accidental but reflected deliberate policy decisions about the nature and purpose of workhouse relief. The architects and administrators who created these institutions believed that family bonds represented potential weaknesses in the system's disciplinary framework. By eliminating regular family contact, they hoped to create environments where individual reform and self-improvement could flourish without the complications of family loyalties and obligations. The separation policy also reflected broader Victorian anxieties about family relationships among the poor. Middle-class observers often viewed working-class family structures with suspicion, believing that inadequate parental supervision and inappropriate family dynamics contributed to poverty and moral decline. The workhouse system aimed to interrupt these patterns by removing children from their parents' influence and placing them under institutional control that would instill proper values and behaviors. Within the children's quarters, substitute family relationships sometimes develop among the young inmates. Older children may take protective roles toward younger ones, creating sibling-like bonds that provide some emotional comfort. These relationships often form along practical lines, with children from the same geographic areas or those who entered the workhouse together maintaining closer connections than those with no shared history. The staff members who work most closely with children, particularly the school teachers and workshop supervisors, sometimes develop genuine care and concern for their charges. However, the institutional nature of their relationships and the constant turnover of both staff and inmates limits the depth and continuity of these connections. Children learn not to become too attached to any particular adult, knowing that reassignments and departures are common. For families with very young children, the separation process unfolds gradually over months or years. Infants remain with their mothers until weaning, usually around their first birthday. This period offers mothers some continued connection to their maternal role, but it also creates intense anxiety about the approaching separation. Mothers often try to delay weaning as long as possible, knowing that once their children are removed to the general children's quarters, their contact will become limited and supervised. The moment of this final separation, when a toddler is taken from his mother's arms to join the other children, represents one of the most emotionally devastating experiences the workhouse system imposes. Mothers often struggle with feelings of failure and loss that persist long after their children have adapted to their new circumstances. The knowledge that their children are housed in the same building, yet remain largely inaccessible, creates a unique form of psychological torment. As seasons change within the workhouse walls, separated families mark the passage of time through brief glimpses and limited visits, rather than through shared experiences. Children grow and develop under institutional care, while their parents age under the stress of separation and hard labor. The natural rhythms of family life, the daily interactions that build and maintain emotional bonds, are replaced by the artificial structure of scheduled visits and supervised meetings. The long-term effects of this separation extend far beyond the immediate emotional pain. Children who spend years in workhouse care often struggle to reconnect with their parents even after leaving the institution. The skills and habits of family intimacy, typically learned through daily interaction, may not develop properly under these circumstances. Some families find that reunion, when it finally comes, requires them to rebuild relationships that have been interrupted for years. Yet within this system of deliberate separation, small acts of connection and love persist. Mothers find ways to send messages to their children through friendly staff members. Fathers create small gifts during their work hours, hoping these tokens might somehow reach their families. Children draw pictures or write letters to parents they rarely see, maintaining emotional connections across the physical barriers imposed by the workhouse system. These small rebellions against separation, these quiet assertions of family love, represent the enduring power of human bonds even under the most challenging circumstances. They remind us that while institutions may control bodies and schedules, they cannot entirely eliminate the deep connections that tie families together. Even in the Victorian workhouse, with all its systematic efforts to divide and isolate, the fundamental human need for family connection finds ways to express itself and survive. Chapter 6. The work is endless. The bell that marks the beginning of your working day in the Victorian workhouse rings at 5 o'clock in the morning, cutting through the grey dawn light that filters weakly through the small barred windows of your dormitory. Sleep, never deep or restful on the thin straw mattress, gives way immediately to the knowledge that another day of labour stretches before you. There is no gradual awakening, no moment of peaceful transition between rest and activity. The bell demands instant compliance, and within minutes you must be dressed in your rough workhouse uniform, and ready to begin the tasks that will occupy every waking hour until evening prayers. The concept of work within the workhouse system extends far beyond simple employment or even hard labour. It represents a fundamental philosophy about poverty, morality, and human nature that shaped every aspect of Victorian poor relief. The architects of the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 believed that poverty resulted primarily from moral failings, particularly laziness and lack of discipline. Work, therefore, served not merely as a means of contributing to the workhouse's operations or teaching useful skills, but as a form of moral correction designed to reform the character of the poor through constant, demanding physical effort. Your first introduction to workhouse labour comes immediately after your initial processing and classification. There is no period of adjustment, no gradual introduction to the routines and expectations that will govern your days. Instead, you are assigned to a work detail based on your age, gender, and physical capabilities, and you begin immediately. The work assignments are not chosen to match your previous experience or skills. A former shopkeeper might find himself breaking stones in the yard, while a woman who once managed her own household spends her days picking oakum in a crowded, poorly ventilated room. Oakum picking represents perhaps the most iconic and universally dreaded form of workhouse labour. This task involves taking old rope, typically recovered from ships or other maritime sources, and painstakingly unravelling it fibre by fibre using only your fingers and a crude metal spike. The rope arrives at the workhouse in large, tangled bundles, stiff with tar and salt, resistant to separation after years of service, holding together the rigging and equipment of sailing vessels. Your job is to reduce these tough, stubborn ropes to their individual fibers, creating a loose, fluffy material that can be sold to shipyards for caulking the seams between wooden planks on ships. The process begins each morning as you take your assigned position on a long wooden bench in the oakum picking room. The space is filled with dozens of similar benches, each accommodating 8 to 10 workers who sit shoulder to shoulder throughout their working hours. The room itself is deliberately kept dim, with small windows set high in the walls, providing just enough light to see your work, but not enough to create a pleasant working environment. The air is thick with fibre dust and the sharp smell of tar, creating an atmosphere that burns your throat and makes breathing difficult after just a few hours of work. Each worker receives a daily quota of rope that must be completely picked clean before the evening meal. The amount varies depending on your perceived strength and experience, but even the smallest daily allocation requires 8 to 10 hours of continuous work to complete. The rope fights back against every attempt to separate its fibers, requiring you to grip tightly and pull with considerable force. Within your first few days, the tips of your fingers begin to crack and bleed from the constant friction and pressure. The rough fibers work their way under your fingernails and embed themselves in the small cuts that develop on your hands, creating a constant burning pain that never quite fades. The metal spike provided for oakum picking is a simple tool, essentially a large needle with a blunt point designed to help separate stubborn fibers. However, the spike must be used carefully, as too much force can cut through the fibers rather than separating them, reducing the value of the finished product. Learning to use the spike effectively requires practice and patience, qualities that are difficult to maintain when you are hungry, tired, and working under constant supervision. Many new inmates struggle with the technique, resulting in damaged work that earns criticism from the workhouse officials, and sometimes reduction in already meager food rations. The psychological impact of oakum picking extends beyond the physical discomfort and pain. The work is mind-numbingly repetitive, requiring no creativity, problem-solving, or skill development. Hour after hour, you perform exactly the same motions, separating fiber after fiber with mechanical precision. Your mind, deprived of stimulation or variety, begins to wander, often dwelling on the circumstances that brought you to this place, or worrying about family members housed in other sections of the workhouse. Some workers find that the repetitive nature of the task allows for a meditative state that helps pass the time, but others struggle with feelings of despair and hopelessness that intensify during the long hours of monotonous labor. Stone breaking represents another common form of workhouse labor, typically assigned to men who are judged capable of heavy physical work. This task takes place in the workhouse yard, a large open area surrounded by high walls that prevent both escape and communication with the outside world. The work involves reducing large stones to smaller pieces, using only hand tools, primarily heavy hammers and metal wedges. The broken stone serves various purposes, from road maintenance to construction projects, providing the workhouse with a source of income while keeping inmates occupied with demanding physical labor. The stones arrive at the workhouse in wagon loads, typically limestone or similar materials quarried from local sources. Each stone weighs anywhere from 50 to several hundred pounds, requiring multiple workers to move the largest pieces into position for breaking. The work begins with careful examination of each stone to identify natural fault lines and weak points where strategic hammer blows might cause productive fractures. This initial assessment requires some skill and experience, but most new inmates learn through trial and error, often wasting considerable effort on ineffective attempts before developing effective techniques. The actual process of stone breaking demands constant, vigorous physical effort. Workers must swing heavy hammers repeatedly throughout their working hours, delivering precise blows that gradually reduce large stones to the smaller pieces required for various construction purposes. The work is exhausting, requiring strong arms, shoulders, and back muscles that many workhouse inmates do not possess when they arrive. Former clerks, shopkeepers, and domestic workers often struggle initially with the physical demands, developing painful blisters and muscle strain that make each day's labor increasingly difficult. The dust created by stone breaking fills the air of the workhouse yard, coating workers in a fine gray powder that infiltrates clothing, hair, and lungs. This dust creates immediate discomfort, making breathing difficult and causing persistent coughing that worsens over time. Long-term exposure to stone dust leads to serious respiratory problems, including the lung disease known as silicosis, which gradually destroys the ability to breathe normally. However, workhouse authorities show little concern for these health consequences, viewing them as acceptable costs of maintaining discipline and generating income through inmate labor. The rhythm of stone-breaking work creates its own form of monotony, different from but equally oppressive as oakum picking. The constant swing of the hammer, the sharp crack of metal against stone, the gradual accumulation of broken pieces all combine to create a hypnotic routine that can continue for hours without variation. Workers often develop calluses and permanent changes to their hand and arm muscles, physical adaptations that mark them as former workhouse inmates long after they leave the institution. Laundry work, typically assigned to women, involves processing the clothing and linens for hundreds of workhouse inmates, as well as contracted work from outside sources. The workhouse laundry operates as both a necessary service for the institution and a commercial enterprise that generates income through contracts with local businesses, hospitals, and middle-class households. The work begins before dawn and continues well into the evening, with women rotating through different stages of the laundering process throughout their long working days. The first stage of laundry work involves sorting and preparing dirty items for washing. This task requires handling clothing and linens that are often heavily soiled and sometimes infested with lice or other parasites. Workers must examine each item carefully, identifying stains and damage that might require special treatment, while sorting materials by color and fabric type to prevent damage during the washing process. The sorting work takes place in rooms filled with large baskets and bins, where the smell of soiled clothing mingles with the dampness and poor ventilation to create an oppressive working environment. The actual washing process takes place in large rooms equipped with enormous wooden tubs and primitive washing machines operated by hand cranks. The water must be heated in coal-fired boilers, a process that begins hours before the washing can start and requires constant attention to maintain proper temperatures. Workers take turns operating the hand-cranked washing machines, devices that agitate clothes and linens in hot, soapy water through mechanical action powered entirely by human effort. The work is physically demanding, requiring sustained effort to keep the machines operating while dealing with hot water, steam, and caustic soap solutions that burn exposed skin. Wringing out the wet laundry requires additional physical effort, as workers must squeeze water from heavy, saturated fabrics using only their hands and simple wooden tools. The wet materials are heavy and awkward to handle, often requiring 2 workers to manage bed sheets and other large items. The constant exposure to hot water and strong soap solutions causes workers' hands to become raw and cracked, with painful splits in the skin that are slow to heal in the damp environment of the laundry rooms. The drying process presents its own challenges, particularly during winter months, when outdoor drying is impossible. Indoor drying rooms, heated by coal fires and filled with lines of wet laundry, become incredibly hot and humid, creating working conditions that are almost unbearable. Workers must continuously move and rearrange wet items to ensure even drying while working in temperatures that often exceed 90 degrees Fahrenheit. The combination of heat, humidity, and poor ventilation leads to frequent fainting and heat exhaustion among laundry workers. Ironing and finishing the dried laundry requires additional hours of work with heavy coal-heated irons that must be constantly reheated and exchanged as they cool. The ironing process demands considerable skill to avoid scorching or damaging fabrics, but workers receive minimal training and are expected to achieve professional results immediately. Mistakes result in criticism and sometimes punishment, adding psychological stress to the already demanding physical requirements of the work. Children in the workhouse are not exempted from labor expectations, though their work assignments are supposedly adjusted for their smaller size and developing strength. In practice, however, children often carry loads and perform tasks that would challenge healthy adults. Boys as young as 8 or 9 are assigned to move heavy baskets of laundry, carry coal for the heating systems, and assist with various maintenance tasks throughout the workhouse. Girls of similar ages work in the kitchens preparing meals for hundreds of inmates, scrub floors on their hands and knees, and help with the lighter aspects of laundry work. The physical demands placed on children often exceed their capabilities, leading to injuries and long-term health problems that follow them throughout their lives. A 10-year-old boy might be expected to carry baskets of wet laundry that weigh nearly as much as he does, while girls spend hours each day scrubbing floors with harsh soap solutions that damage their hands and knees. The rationale for assigning such demanding work to children centers on the belief that early exposure to hard labor will instill proper work habits and prevent the development of lazy or undisciplined attitudes. Educational opportunities for children, while mandated by law, often take second place to labor requirements. Children might spend an hour or two in basic lessons each day, learning elementary reading, writing, and arithmetic, but the majority of their time is dedicated to productive work that contributes to the workhouse's operations. The balance between education and labor varies among different workhouses, but economic pressures typically favor work assignments over classroom instruction. The supervision of workhouse labor operates through a system of constant observation and immediate correction. Work supervisors, often inmates who have demonstrated reliability and compliance, monitor every aspect of the labor process. They watch for signs of slowing pace, poor quality work, or any behavior that might be interpreted as laziness or defiance. The supervisors report regularly to workhouse officials, who maintain detailed records of each inmate's work performance and attitude. The consequences of unsatisfactory work performance are swift and sometimes severe. Inmates who fail to meet their daily quotas might have their already minimal food rations reduced, face additional work assignments as punishment, or be confined to solitary cells for periods of reflection and correction. The threat of such punishments creates an atmosphere of constant anxiety, where workers push themselves beyond their physical limits to avoid official displeasure. The quality standards for workhouse labor are often unreasonably high, particularly given the poor nutrition, inadequate rest, and primitive tools provided to workers. Oakum must be picked to exact specifications, with no shortcuts or incomplete separation accepted. Broken stone must be reduced to precise sizes, with pieces that are too large or too small rejected and requiring additional work. Laundry must be cleaned to commercial standards despite inadequate equipment and harsh working conditions. These demanding standards ensure that workers remain constantly busy and under pressure, with little opportunity for rest or relaxation during working hours. The economic motivation behind workhouse labor creates additional pressure on both inmates and officials. The institutions are expected to offset their operating costs through the sale of products and services produced by inmate labor. This economic imperative means that productivity and efficiency take precedence over worker comfort, safety, or long-term health. Inmates are viewed primarily as a source of labor rather than as human beings deserving of human treatment, and their work assignments reflect this utilitarian perspective. Seasonal variations in available work create additional challenges for workhouse management and inmates alike. During winter months, outdoor work like stone breaking becomes more difficult and sometimes impossible, requiring adjustments to work assignments and daily routines. Indoor work areas become overcrowded as activities are consolidated, while heating costs increase the economic pressure to maintain high productivity levels. Summer brings its own challenges, with hot weather making indoor work areas nearly unbearable, while creating new opportunities for outdoor labor that must be carefully managed to prevent heat-related illness. The tools and equipment provided for workhouse labor are typically of the lowest possible quality, selected more for durability and cost than for efficiency or worker comfort. Hammers used for stone breaking are often poorly balanced and uncomfortable to use for extended periods. The metal spikes used for oakum picking are crude and sometimes poorly sharpened, making the work more difficult than necessary. Laundry equipment is basic and often in poor repair, requiring workers to adapt their techniques to accommodate malfunctioning machinery and inadequate supplies. Safety considerations in workhouse labor are minimal, with officials viewing workplace injuries as inevitable consequences of necessary work, rather than preventable problems requiring attention. Workers receive little or no training in safe work practices, and protective equipment is virtually unknown. Stone breaking proceeds without eye protection, despite the constant danger from flying chips and dust. Laundry workers handle caustic chemicals and operate dangerous machinery without safety training or protective gear. The result is a high rate of workplace injuries that are treated as individual misfortunes rather than systematic problems requiring institutional response. The psychological impact of endless demanding labor compounds the physical hardships of workhouse life. Workers who once took pride in their skills and accomplishments find themselves reduced to performing mindless repetitive tasks that offer no opportunity for creativity, advancement, or personal satisfaction. The knowledge that tomorrow will bring exactly the same work, and the day after that, and every day for the foreseeable future, creates a sense of hopelessness that pervades every aspect of workhouse existence. Some inmates develop coping strategies that help them endure the monotony and physical demands of their assigned labor. They might focus intensely on the work itself, finding satisfaction in achieving daily quotas or maintaining quality standards despite difficult conditions. Others retreat mentally during working hours, using the repetitive nature of their tasks to enter almost meditative states that help time pass more quickly. These individual adaptations help some workers survive psychologically, but they cannot eliminate the fundamental dehumanizing aspects of the workhouse labor system. The social dynamics within workgroups provide another dimension to the daily experience of workhouse labor. Workers who share similar tasks often develop informal support networks, helping each other meet quotas and cope with particularly difficult days. Experienced workers might share techniques and shortcuts with newcomers, while stronger individuals sometimes assist those who struggle with the physical demands of their assignments. These relationships, formed under shared hardship, often represent the only positive human connections available within the harsh environment of the workhouse. However, the constant pressure to meet quotas and avoid punishment also creates tensions and conflicts among workers. Competition for the easier work assignments, disputes over shared tools and workspace, and resentment toward those who seem to receive preferential treatment all contribute to an atmosphere of suspicion and conflict that undermines potential solidarity among inmates. The workhouse system deliberately encourages such divisions, believing that cooperation among inmates might lead to collective resistance or demands for better treatment. As your first day of workhouse labor draws to a close, marked by the evening bell that signals the end of formal work hours, you realize that the concept of rest is relative within these walls. While the major work assignments may cease, there are always additional tasks to be completed: cleaning work areas, preparing tools and materials for the next day, personal maintenance of clothing and bedding. The hours designated for rest are brief and often interrupted by various institutional requirements, ensuring that the cycle of work and minimal rest continues with relentless regularity. The endless nature of workhouse labor extends beyond the daily repetition of assigned tasks to encompass the broader reality that escape from this routine depends on factors largely beyond individual control. Economic conditions in the outside world, the availability of employment, and the complex bureaucracy of poor relief all influence how long any individual might remain subject to the workhouse work regime. For many inmates, the prospect of eventual release seems increasingly distant as days of hard labor blend into weeks and months of identical routine, creating a sense of permanent imprisonment, despite the theoretical possibility of leaving when circumstances improve. Chapter 7. Illness spreads faster than sympathy. The first cough you hear in the workhouse dormitory comes in the deep hours of the night, cutting through the restless breathing of dozens of sleeping bodies packed into narrow beds, arranged in precise rows. It is not a single discrete sound, but rather a persistent rattling disturbance that speaks of lungs struggling against infection and inflammation. The cough belongs to the man in the bed nearest the small barred window, an older fellow who arrived just days before you, already bearing the telltale signs of respiratory distress that mark so many of the workhouse's long-term residents. As the nights pass, that solitary cough multiplies, spreading from bed to bed with the inexorable persistence of contagion in an overcrowded, poorly ventilated space. Soon the dormitory fills each evening with a symphony of respiratory distress, wet productive coughs that bring up blood-tinged sputum, dry hacking sounds that seem to tear at the throat, and the labored breathing of those whose lungs no longer function with healthy efficiency. The sounds become so constant that they form a backdrop to sleep, a reminder that illness permeates every aspect of workhouse existence. The Victorian workhouse system, despite its claims to provide shelter and care for the destitute, created conditions that were ideally suited for the rapid transmission of infectious diseases. The overcrowded sleeping quarters, where beds were placed so closely together that occupants could easily reach across to touch their neighbors, ensured that respiratory droplets from coughing and sneezing could travel freely from person to person throughout the night hours. The poor ventilation in these spaces, designed more to prevent escape than to promote health, meant that infected air circulated sluggishly, if at all, allowing pathogens to accumulate in concentrations that made transmission almost inevitable. Tuberculosis, known in the Victorian era as consumption, represented perhaps the most feared and persistent health threat within workhouse walls. This bacterial infection, which primarily attacks the lungs but can spread to other organs, thrived in the conditions that defined institutional life for the poor. The disease spread through airborne droplets expelled when infected individuals coughed, sneezed, or even spoke, making the close quarters and poor ventilation of workhouse dormitories perfect breeding grounds for transmission. The chronic malnutrition that characterized workhouse diets weakened inmates' immune systems, making them particularly susceptible to infection and reducing their ability to fight off the disease once contracted. The progression of tuberculosis within the workhouse population followed predictable patterns that officials came to accept as inevitable rather than preventable. New arrivals, often already weakened by the poverty and hardship that brought them to seek workhouse relief, were particularly vulnerable to infection. Within weeks of arrival, they might begin to exhibit the early symptoms: persistent fatigue that went beyond normal tiredness, unexplained weight loss, despite the filling nature of workhouse meals, and night sweats that left their bedding damp each morning. These early signs were often dismissed as natural adjustments to workhouse life, rather than indicators of serious illness developing. As tuberculosis progressed in affected inmates, the symptoms became more obvious and distressing. The characteristic cough developed gradually, beginning as a dry irritation that seemed to respond to nothing, then evolving into a productive cough that brought up increasing amounts of sputum. In the advanced stages, this sputum became tinged with blood, creating dark stains on handkerchiefs and bedding that marked the sufferer as infectious and dangerous to others. The blood came from lung tissue damaged by the bacterial infection, evidence of the disease's destructive progress through the respiratory system. The fever associated with tuberculosis created additional challenges for both sufferers and those around them. In the evening hours, infected individuals often experienced temperature spikes that left them burning hot and delirious, only to wake in the early morning hours, drenched in sweat as their fevers broke temporarily. These cycles repeated night after night, gradually wearing down the patient's strength while creating uncomfortable conditions for nearby inmates who shared the overheated, humid air of the dormitory spaces. Rickets, a disease caused by vitamin D deficiency, affected primarily the children housed in workhouse facilities, though adults who had experienced childhood malnutrition often bore its permanent marks. The disease developed slowly, over months and years of inadequate nutrition and insufficient exposure to sunlight, both common conditions in workhouse settings. Children affected by rickets experienced softening of their bones, leading to characteristic deformities that included bowed legs, enlarged joints, and delayed growth that left them significantly smaller than their healthy peers. The diet provided in most workhouses, while sufficient in quantity to prevent outright starvation, lacked many of the essential nutrients needed for proper bone development in children. The absence of fresh fruits and vegetables, combined with limited access to dairy products and other sources of calcium and vitamin D, created conditions where rickets could develop even among children who received regular meals. The windowless or poorly lit spaces, where children spent most of their time, further contributed to vitamin D deficiency, as their bodies could not synthesize this essential nutrient without adequate exposure to sunlight. Children with rickets faced particular challenges in meeting the work expectations placed upon them within the workhouse system. Their weakened bones and delayed development made it difficult to carry the heavy loads assigned to them. Yet workhouse officials often interpreted their struggles as laziness or defiance rather than symptoms of disease. The painful joint deformities associated with rickets made prolonged standing or walking uncomfortable, but children were still expected to spend long hours in workshops and classrooms, often developing chronic pain that would follow them throughout their lives. Fevers of unknown origin swept through workhouse populations with alarming regularity, spreading rapidly through the closely packed dormitories and work areas. These fever epidemics often began with one or two individuals developing sudden onset illness, characterized by high temperatures, severe headaches, and general weakness that made normal activities impossible. Within days, dozens of inmates might be affected, overwhelming the limited medical resources available within the institution. The causes of these fever outbreaks varied, ranging from influenza and other viral infections to more serious bacterial diseases like typhoid fever, which could prove fatal if left untreated. The poor sanitation conditions in many workhouses, combined with contaminated water sources and inadequate waste disposal, created ideal conditions for the transmission of waterborne diseases that caused severe gastrointestinal symptoms along with high fevers. Inmates suffering from these conditions experienced violent vomiting and diarrhea that quickly led to dehydration and electrolyte imbalances, particularly dangerous for children and elderly residents. The medical care available to workhouse inmates consisted primarily of a single sick room or infirmary ward, usually a converted dormitory space with beds arranged in rows similar to the regular sleeping quarters, but designated for those too ill to continue their normal activities. This sick room often lacked proper ventilation, heating, or specialized equipment, offering little more than a place to lie down away from the regular work assignments. The number of beds in these infirmaries was typically insufficient for the actual medical needs of the population, meaning that only the most severely ill inmates could be accommodated while others continued to work despite significant symptoms. Professional medical care in the form of trained doctors was rarely available on a regular basis within workhouse facilities. Most institutions relied on a local physician who might visit once or twice per week, if at all, to examine the most seriously ill patients. These brief visits, often lasting only an hour or two, were insufficient to provide proper diagnosis and treatment for the complex medical conditions that developed among the malnourished, overworked, and poorly housed workhouse population. Many inmates never saw a qualified medical professional during their entire stay, regardless of their health problems. The absence of trained medical staff meant that most day-to-day medical care fell to other inmates who had been designated as nurses or medical assistants based on previous experience or demonstrated competence rather than formal training. These pauper nurses, as they were known, did their best to provide comfort and basic care to their fellow inmates, but they lacked the knowledge and resources necessary to treat serious illnesses effectively. They could offer water to feverish patients, help maintain basic cleanliness, and provide companionship to the suffering. But they could not prescribe medications, perform medical procedures, or make informed decisions about treatment options. The medications available within workhouse infirmaries were limited to the most basic remedies, often consisting of little more than laudanum for pain relief and various herbal preparations of questionable effectiveness. More sophisticated treatments, including the emerging antibiotics and other advanced medications of the late Victorian period, were typically unavailable due to cost considerations and the low priority placed on inmate healthcare. Even basic supplies like clean bandages, disinfectants, and proper medical instruments were often in short supply, forcing medical personnel to improvise treatments with whatever materials were available. The psychological impact of illness within the workhouse environment created additional suffering beyond the physical symptoms of disease. Inmates who became seriously ill faced the terrifying prospect of dying among strangers, far from family members who might not even know of their condition. The knowledge that medical care was minimal and that recovery depended largely on individual constitution rather than professional treatment created anxiety and despair that often worsened the progression of illness. For those who did survive serious illness within the workhouse, recovery was often incomplete and prolonged. The combination of poor nutrition, inadequate medical care, and the immediate return to demanding physical labor as soon as symptoms improved meant that many inmates never fully regained their health. Chronic conditions like persistent coughs, joint pain, and general weakness became permanent features of life for many workhouse residents, accepted as inevitable consequences of their circumstances rather than treatable medical conditions. The fear of becoming ill within the workhouse system created a perverse incentive structure where inmates often concealed symptoms and continued working despite significant health problems. The knowledge that illness might result in isolation in the infirmary, away from any familiar faces or sources of emotional support, combined with the understanding that recovery time was limited regardless of actual health status, encouraged people to push themselves beyond their physical limits. This tendency to hide illness and continue working while sick contributed to the rapid spread of contagious diseases throughout the workhouse population. Children were particularly vulnerable to the health hazards of workhouse life, both because their developing immune systems were less capable of fighting off infections and because their smaller size made them more susceptible to the effects of malnutrition and environmental toxins. The high rates of childhood mortality in workhouses reflected this vulnerability, with death rates among children often exceeding those in the general population by significant margins. Many children who survived their workhouse experience carried permanent health effects, including stunted growth, chronic respiratory problems, and developmental delays that affected their entire lives. The seasonal patterns of illness within workhouses followed predictable cycles that reflected both the changing weather conditions and the varying availability of food and fuel for heating. Winter months brought increased rates of respiratory infections as inmates crowded into poorly heated spaces, while summer periods saw outbreaks of gastrointestinal diseases related to food spoilage and inadequate sanitation. Spring and fall transitions often triggered epidemics as the workhouse population adjusted to changing conditions, and new arrivals brought infections from outside communities. The stigma associated with workhouse residents extended to medical conditions contracted within these institutions, creating barriers to care even after inmates left the workhouse system. Former residents who bore the visible signs of diseases like rickets or tuberculosis faced discrimination in employment and social situations, making it difficult to rebuild their lives even after escaping the institutional environment. The association between certain diseases and workhouse residents meant that having these conditions marked individuals as former paupers, carrying social consequences that extended far beyond the immediate health effects. Pregnancy and childbirth within the workhouse system presented particular medical challenges, as expectant mothers often arrived already malnourished and continued to receive inadequate nutrition throughout their pregnancies. The lack of specialized obstetric care meant that complications during pregnancy and delivery were often handled by untrained staff using primitive techniques and equipment. Infant mortality rates in workhouses were consistently higher than in the general population, reflecting both the poor health of mothers and the inadequate medical care available during the critical early weeks of life. The management of mental health conditions within workhouse medical systems was virtually non-existent, with individuals suffering from depression, anxiety, and other psychological disorders receiving no specialized treatment or understanding. The harsh conditions and social isolation of workhouse life often exacerbated existing mental health problems while creating new ones, but the medical framework of the time had little to offer in terms of effective treatment. Those whose mental distress manifested in disruptive behavior were typically punished rather than treated, while those who became withdrawn and passive were often ignored entirely. Chronic conditions like arthritis, heart disease, and digestive disorders, common among the elderly workhouse population, received minimal attention and virtually no effective treatment. These conditions, while not immediately life-threatening, significantly reduced quality of life and made the physical demands of workhouse labor even more challenging. Elderly inmates often experienced progressive deterioration of their health conditions due to the combination of inadequate medical care, poor nutrition, and continued physical demands that exceeded their capabilities. The isolation of sick inmates within the workhouse infirmary, while intended to prevent the spread of contagious diseases, often created additional psychological trauma for individuals who were already struggling with serious illness. Patients in the infirmary were cut off from the minimal social connections they had developed within their regular dormitory groups, leaving them to face their illness alone, except for brief interactions with overwhelmed medical staff. This isolation was particularly difficult for children, who might spend weeks in the infirmary without seeing familiar faces or receiving the emotional support that could aid in their recovery. The economic pressures that shaped workhouse operations directly impacted medical care decisions, with cost considerations often taking precedence over patient needs. Expensive treatments were typically avoided, even when they might have been effective, while cheaper alternatives were pursued regardless of their likelihood of success. This economic calculus meant that treatable conditions often went untreated, allowing them to progress to more serious stages that were both more costly to address and more likely to result in permanent disability or death. The documentation of illness and death within workhouse systems was often incomplete and inaccurate, making it difficult to track disease patterns or identify areas where medical interventions might have been effective. Record-keeping focused more on administrative concerns than medical ones, with detailed information about work assignments and behavioral issues taking precedence over health status and treatment outcomes. This lack of proper medical documentation contributed to the perpetuation of ineffective treatment approaches and prevented the identification of systemic health problems that might have been addressed through policy changes. As you lie in your narrow bed, listening to the persistent coughing that fills the dormitory each night, you begin to understand that illness in the workhouse represents more than just physical discomfort or inconvenience. It becomes a constant presence that shapes every aspect of daily life, from the fear of contagion that makes inmates suspicious of one another, to the knowledge that becoming seriously ill might mean dying alone and forgotten. The inadequate medical care available within the system means that minor health problems often become major ones, while serious conditions frequently prove fatal due to neglect and lack of proper treatment. Your own health, which you may have taken for granted before entering the workhouse, becomes a precious resource that must be carefully protected and preserved. Every cough, every fever, every sign of physical weakness carries the potential for catastrophic consequences in an environment where medical care is minimal and the expectation to continue working never diminishes. The realization that you must pray not for health and recovery, but simply for the strength to keep working despite illness, represents one of the most dehumanizing aspects of workhouse existence, reducing human beings to mere units of labor whose value depends entirely on their continued productivity, rather than their inherent worth as individuals. Chapter 8. Meals are barely meals. The bell that summons you to your first meal in the Victorian Workhouse rings at precisely 6 o'clock in the morning, cutting through the grey dawn light that filters weakly through the high, barred windows of the dining hall. As you file into this cavernous space alongside dozens of other inmates, the silence is profound and unsettling. No conversation fills the air, no clatter of eager preparation for the day's first nourishment. Instead, there is only the shuffle of worn shoes against stone floors, and the occasional cough echoing off the bare walls, creating an atmosphere more reminiscent of a funeral procession than a gathering for a meal. The dining hall itself reflects the austere philosophy that governs every aspect of workhouse life. Long wooden tables stretch across the room in precise rows, their surfaces scrubbed clean but bearing the stains and scratches of countless previous meals. The benches that flank these tables are hard and uncomfortable, designed more for efficiency than comfort, forcing diners to maintain upright postures that discourage lingering over food. High windows set near the ceiling provide minimal natural light, while gas lamps mounted on the walls cast a dim yellowish glow that makes even the most appetizing food appear unappetizing. Your assigned seat at one of these tables becomes your designated place for every meal throughout your stay in the workhouse. The seating arrangements follow the same rigid classifications that govern all aspects of institutional life, with men, women, and children occupying separate sections of the hall. Within each section, further divisions separate the elderly from the younger adults, the able-bodied from the infirm, and the long-term residents from the recent arrivals. These arrangements ensure that inmates remain isolated within their assigned categories, preventing the formation of social bonds that might provide comfort or support during the difficult process of adapting to workhouse life. The meal service begins with the arrival of servers, typically inmates who have been assigned kitchen duties as part of their daily labor requirements. These individuals move efficiently between the tables, carrying large metal pots and ladles that allow them to dispense measured portions to each diner. The portions are calculated with mathematical precision, designed to provide just enough nutrition to sustain life and work capacity, while remaining sufficiently meager to discourage people from seeking workhouse relief unnecessarily. Every spoonful is counted, every serving weighed against strict guidelines that prioritize economy over adequate nourishment. The gruel that forms the foundation of most workhouse meals arrives in your bowl as a thin grayish liquid that bears little resemblance to any food you might have eaten in your previous life. This mixture, created by boiling oats or other cheap grains in water with minimal seasoning, provides basic carbohydrates and a small amount of protein, but lacks the nutrients necessary for optimal health. The consistency varies from day to day depending on the skill of the cook and the quality of ingredients available, ranging from a watery soup that offers little substance to a thick paste that requires considerable effort to swallow. The taste of workhouse gruel defies easy description, combining blandness with an underlying bitterness that may come from poor quality ingredients or inadequate preparation techniques. Salt, when used at all, is applied sparingly, creating a flavor profile that seems designed to discourage enjoyment rather than provide satisfaction. Some inmates report that the gruel carries a slightly sour undertone, possibly from fermentation that occurs when ingredients are stored too long in inadequate conditions. Others describe a metallic taste that may result from the large iron pots used for cooking, equipment that prioritizes durability and cost-effectiveness over food quality. The bread accompanying your gruel represents one of the few solid foods provided regularly in the workhouse diet. This bread, baked in large batches using the cheapest available flour, differs significantly from the varieties you may have enjoyed in your former life. The texture is dense and heavy, with a coarse crumb that reflects the use of lower-grade flour containing more bran and impurities than refined products. The crust, while providing some textural interest, is often hard enough to require soaking in liquid before it can be chewed comfortably, particularly challenging for elderly inmates with poor dental health. The size of your bread portion is carefully regulated according to institutional guidelines that specify exact weights for different categories of inmates. Adult men typically receive larger portions than women or children, reflecting assumptions about caloric needs based on the physical labor expected from each group. However, these calculations often fail to account for individual variations in metabolism, health status, or the actual energy demands of assigned work tasks. The result is a one-size-fits-all approach to nutrition that leaves many inmates chronically undernourished, while providing others with barely adequate sustenance. Tea service in the workhouse represents a pale shadow of the comforting beverage that might have provided warmth and pleasure in your previous circumstances. The liquid served as tea is typically a weak infusion made from the cheapest available leaves, often reused multiple times to extract maximum economic value before disposal. The resulting brew lacks the robust flavor and stimulating properties of properly prepared tea, instead offering a slightly colored hot water with minimal taste or nutritional value. Sugar, when provided at all, is rationed in tiny quantities that barely sweeten the bitter liquid. The weekly meat ration, when it materializes, arrives as a small portion of the cheapest cuts available, often consisting of fatty bacon, tough beef, or questionable pork that has been purchased at reduced prices due to quality concerns. The preparation of this meat typically involves boiling in large quantities of water, a cooking method that extracts much of the flavor and nutritional value while creating a product that is both unappetizing and difficult to digest. The portions are measured with the same precision applied to all workhouse food, ensuring that each inmate receives exactly the amount specified by regulations, regardless of individual needs or preferences. The anticipation surrounding the weekly meat distribution creates one of the few breaks in the monotonous routine of workhouse dining. Inmates who have grown accustomed to the daily repetition of gruel and bread find themselves looking forward to this single variation in their diet, even though the quality and quantity of meat provided rarely justify such anticipation. The psychological impact of having something different to eat, however minimal, provides a brief respite from the grinding sameness that characterizes most aspects of workhouse existence. The enforcement of silence during meals represents one of the most psychologically challenging aspects of workhouse dining. The natural human tendency to socialize during eating, to share conversation and companionship while consuming food, is completely suppressed by regulations that treat any vocalization as a punishable offense. This enforced quiet transforms meals from potential moments of human connection and comfort into isolated, solitary experiences that emphasize each individual's separation from others and their reduction to mere units requiring fuel for continued labor. The reasoning behind this silence rule extends beyond simple crowd control or administrative convenience. Workhouse officials believed that conversation during meals might lead to complaints about food quality, discussions of grievances against the institution, or the formation of social bonds that could undermine the disciplinary atmosphere they sought to maintain. By eliminating opportunities for verbal communication during the 3 daily meal periods, administrators could prevent the development of collective dissatisfaction or organized resistance to institutional policies. The physical act of eating under these conditions of enforced silence and minimal nourishment takes on an almost ritualistic quality. Each inmate learns to consume their allocated portions methodically, making the small amounts of food last as long as possible, while remaining aware that any attempt to savor or enjoy the meal might be interpreted as inappropriate behavior. The scraping of spoons against bowl bottoms becomes one of the few sounds that breaks the oppressive quiet, creating an audio backdrop that emphasizes the inadequacy of the portions being consumed. Hunger, initially an acute sensation that demands immediate attention, gradually transforms into a constant background presence that colors every aspect of daily life. The feeling of emptiness in your stomach becomes as familiar as the rough texture of your workhouse clothing or the hardness of your sleeping surface. Your body adapts to this chronic state of inadequate nourishment by slowing metabolic processes, reducing energy expenditure wherever possible, and developing an intense focus on food-related thoughts that can dominate conscious awareness for hours at a time. The psychological effects of chronic hunger extend far beyond simple physical discomfort. Malnutrition affects cognitive function, making it difficult to concentrate on tasks or maintain emotional equilibrium. Irritability increases as blood sugar levels fluctuate throughout the day, while the constant preoccupation with food thoughts interferes with sleep and rest. Social interactions, already limited by workhouse regulations, become even more strained as hunger-induced mood changes affect interpersonal relationships among inmates. The dreams of workhouse inmates often center around food, creating elaborate fantasies of abundant meals that provide temporary psychological relief from the reality of chronic hunger. These food dreams can be so vivid and detailed that waking up to face another day of meager rations becomes particularly cruel, emphasizing the stark contrast between the nourishment the mind craves and the minimal sustenance the institution provides. Some inmates report that these dreams become more frequent and intense over time, as if the subconscious mind attempts to compensate for the deprivation experienced during waking hours. The seasonal variations in workhouse food reflect the agricultural cycles that govern food production and availability, but these changes rarely result in improved nutrition for inmates. During harvest seasons, when fresh vegetables might be abundant and inexpensive, workhouse kitchens occasionally incorporate small amounts of potatoes, turnips, or cabbage into the daily rations. However, these additions typically replace rather than supplement existing food items, maintaining the same overall caloric intake while providing minimal variation in flavor or nutritional content. Winter months often bring deterioration in food quality as stored ingredients begin to spoil or lose nutritional value. Root vegetables become soft and tasteless, while preserved meats develop strong flavors that may indicate early stages of decomposition. The lack of fresh produce during cold months eliminates sources of essential vitamins, contributing to the development of deficiency diseases like scurvy among long-term inmates. The additional calories needed to maintain body temperature during winter are rarely provided through increased food rations, forcing bodies to burn stored fat and muscle tissue to generate heat. The kitchen facilities responsible for preparing workhouse meals operate under constraints that make quality food production nearly impossible. Large quantities of food must be prepared using minimal fuel, basic equipment, and unskilled labor provided by inmates assigned to kitchen duties. The cooking staff, typically paupers themselves with no formal culinary training, learn their responsibilities through trial and error while working with ingredients that would challenge even experienced cooks. The result is food that meets basic caloric requirements while failing to provide adequate nutrition, palatability, or safety standards. Food storage within workhouse facilities often contributes to quality problems that affect both taste and nutritional value. Dry goods like flour and oats may be stored in damp conditions that promote mold growth or insect infestation. Root vegetables kept in inadequate cellars often develop rot that must be cut away before cooking, reducing both quantity and quality of available ingredients. Meat products, purchased in large quantities to achieve cost savings, may begin to spoil before they can be consumed, forcing kitchen staff to use questionable ingredients or face shortages that would leave inmates even hungrier than usual. The economic pressures that shape workhouse food policies create a system where cost considerations consistently override nutritional or humanitarian concerns. Purchasing decisions prioritize the cheapest available options regardless of quality, while portion sizes are calculated to minimize expenses rather than provide adequate nourishment. The result is a food system that technically meets the legal requirements for feeding institutional populations while failing to support the health and well-being of the individuals it serves. Children in the workhouse face particular challenges related to inadequate nutrition, as their growing bodies require more calories and nutrients per pound of body weight than adults. The standardized portions provided to all inmates, regardless of age, often leave children chronically undernourished, affecting their physical development, cognitive function, and resistance to disease. Young children may struggle to consume the full portions of gruel and bread provided, finding the textures and flavors unpalatable, while older children often remain hungry after finishing their allocated food. The long-term health consequences of workhouse nutrition become apparent in the physical condition of long-term inmates. Chronic malnutrition leads to muscle wasting, poor wound healing, and increased susceptibility to infectious diseases. Vitamin deficiencies cause specific health problems like night blindness, dental issues, and skin conditions that mark individuals as former workhouse residents long after they leave the institution. The stunted growth observed in children who spend significant time in workhouse care reflects the cumulative impact of inadequate nutrition during critical developmental periods. The social dynamics surrounding food distribution create additional stress and conflict within the workhouse population. Inmates closely monitor the serving process, watching for any signs of favoritism or variation in portion sizes that might indicate unfair treatment. Accusations of unequal distribution can lead to tensions between inmates and conflicts with staff members responsible for food service. The scarcity of food makes every morsel valuable, creating an environment where even small differences in portion size can generate significant resentment and discord. The medical implications of chronic malnutrition extend beyond the obvious effects of hunger to encompass a wide range of health problems that compromise inmates' ability to work and survive. Protein deficiency leads to edema and muscle weakness that makes physical labor more difficult and dangerous. Iron deficiency causes anemia that results in fatigue and reduced work capacity. Vitamin deficiencies contribute to a host of problems, including impaired immune function, poor wound healing, and neurological symptoms that affect both physical and mental performance. The preparation rituals that surround meals, from the ringing of bells to the orderly filing into dining halls, create a structured routine that provides some psychological comfort even when the food itself offers little satisfaction. These predictable patterns help inmates organize their days around fixed reference points, while providing brief respites from the demanding physical labor that occupies most waking hours. The anticipation of meals, however inadequate, gives inmates something to look forward to during long periods of monotonous work. The waste policies governing workhouse dining ensure that even the smallest scraps of food are not discarded carelessly. Leftover bread is often saved for future meals, while food scraps may be collected for use in soup stocks or animal feed. These practices, while economically sensible, also contribute to food safety problems when improperly stored leftovers begin to spoil before they can be consumed. The pressure to avoid waste sometimes results in the serving of food that is past its prime, adding unpleasant flavors and potential health risks to meals that are already barely adequate. As you sit in the dining hall consuming your meager portion of gruel and bread, surrounded by the oppressive silence that prevents any expression of complaint or companionship, you begin to understand that meals in the workhouse serve purposes beyond simple nutrition. They represent daily reminders of your reduced circumstances, regular demonstrations of your dependence on institutional charity, and systematic reinforcement of the social order that places you at the bottom of society's hierarchy. The inadequate quantities and poor quality of food provided send clear messages about your value as a human being, and the minimal resources society is willing to invest in your survival and well-being. Satch Chapter 9. The overseer is watching in the quiet corridors of the Victorian Workhouse, There moves a figure whose presence casts long shadows across the daily existence of every soul within those walls. This is the overseer, a man whose authority extends into every corner of this institution, every moment of your waking hours. His footsteps echo with a particular rhythm that becomes as familiar as your own heartbeat, a steady percussion that announces his approach long before you see his silhouette appear in doorways. These footsteps carry with them the weight of absolute power, the sound of keys jangling softly against his hip as he moves through the endless maze of rooms and corridors that make up your new world. The overseer's keys are perhaps the most defining aspect of his presence, a metallic symphony that follows him wherever he goes. These are not merely tools for opening doors, but symbols of control, of access, of the boundary between freedom and confinement. Each key on his ring serves a specific purpose, unlocking different areas of the workhouse that remain forbidden to you. There are keys for the storerooms where food is kept under careful measure, keys for the workshops where the more skilled labor takes place, keys for the punishment cells that exist in the darker corners of the building. The sound of these keys creates a constant reminder of your position in this hierarchy, a gentle but persistent chiming that speaks of your limitations and his power to enforce them. Alongside the keys, the overseer carries a cane, not always for the purpose of physical support, but as an extension of his authority. This cane serves multiple functions in the daily operations of the workhouse. It taps against walls and floors as he walks, creating additional sounds that help him monitor the pace and rhythm of work in different areas. When he enters a room, the cane often rests against his shoulder or taps lightly against his palm, a subtle gesture that reminds everyone present of his ability to enforce discipline. The cane becomes a tool of measurement, pointing to areas that require attention, indicating workers who need redirecting, marking time and space in ways that reinforce the structured nature of workhouse life. The overseer moves through the workhouse with a practiced efficiency that comes from years of managing such institutions. His routes are calculated and purposeful, designed to maximize his oversight while minimizing wasted motion. He appears in different areas at unpredictable times, ensuring that the possibility of his presence hangs over every activity throughout the day. This unpredictability becomes one of his most effective tools for maintaining order, as workers never know when he might materialize in their vicinity. Observing their performance, noting their behavior, making mental records of their compliance or resistance. In this environment, the concept of anonymity dissolves completely. While you might hope to blend into the crowd of faces that populate the workhouse, the overseer possesses an remarkable ability to distinguish between individuals, particularly when it comes to matters of discipline and correction. Your name, which you might have thought would be lost among the dozens or hundreds of others in the institution, becomes something that exists primarily in the context of wrongdoing. The overseer seems to have little interest in learning names for positive recognition or encouragement. Instead, names are tools of accountability, spoken sharply when infractions occur, called out across rooms when behavior needs correcting, written in the punishment ledgers that track the daily struggles of workhouse life. This selective recognition creates a peculiar psychological environment where being known becomes associated with trouble, where drawing attention to yourself inevitably leads to negative consequences. The overseer's memory for names appears to activate most clearly when punishment is required, when examples need to be made, when the authority of the institution needs reinforcing through individual correction. Your identity becomes bound up with your mistakes, your moments of weakness, your failures to meet the exacting standards that govern workhouse existence. The expression on the overseer's face rarely varies from a carefully maintained neutrality, but within this apparent calm lies a complex system of evaluation and judgment. Every gesture you make, every expression that crosses your face, every interaction with fellow inmates falls under his scrutiny. In this world, the simple act of smiling becomes fraught with potential danger. A smile might be interpreted as evidence of insufficient suffering, a sign that the workhouse regime is not adequately teaching you the lessons it was designed to impart. Contentment, even momentary happiness, can be seen as inappropriate given your circumstances, a failure to properly understand the gravity of your situation and the need for moral improvement that brought you to this place. The overseer views genuine emotion with suspicion, particularly emotions that suggest comfort or satisfaction with your current state. A smile shared between workers might indicate the formation of friendships that could potentially undermine the disciplinary structure of the institution. Laughter, even quiet laughter, could suggest that inmates are finding ways to enjoy themselves, despite the deliberately harsh conditions designed to discourage dependency on public assistance. Any sign of lightness or joy becomes evidence that the workhouse is failing in its mission to make residence so unpleasant that individuals will do anything necessary to avoid returning. But while smiling draws suspicion, silence presents its own set of problems in the overseer's worldview. Extended quiet periods might indicate plotting or planning, secret communications between inmates, or the development of resistance to the institutional routine. The overseer interprets prolonged silence as potentially subversive, a sign that workers are withdrawing from the community structure and developing their own internal worlds that exist beyond his control and influence. This silence might mask resentment, anger, or plans for disruption that could threaten the careful order he works to maintain. The challenge of existing under such scrutiny becomes a constant mental exercise in finding the appropriate middle ground between these extremes. Too much expression draws attention and punishment, while too little expression suggests hidden defiance. The overseer expects a precise calibration of demeanor that demonstrates proper submission without indicating either contentment or rebellion. This narrow acceptable range creates a state of constant tension where every facial expression must be carefully managed, every response calculated to avoid triggering the suspicion that seems to lurk always just beneath the surface of his professional demeanor. In the overseer's judgment system, the concept of laziness expands far beyond simple reluctance to work. Any behavior that does not contribute directly to the productive operation of the workhouse, any moment of rest that exceeds what has been officially sanctioned, any pace of work that falls below the expected standard, becomes classified as laziness. This definition encompasses not just obvious instances of avoiding labor, but also subtle variations in effort, brief moments of fatigue, or any sign that you are not pushing yourself to the absolute limits of your physical capabilities at every moment. The overseer's understanding of laziness extends into areas that might surprise those unfamiliar with workhouse culture. Taking too long to eat your allocated meal might be seen as laziness, an inefficient use of time that could be better spent in productive labor. Walking too slowly between work areas, even when you are carrying heavy materials or dealing with physical discomfort, can be interpreted as an attempt to avoid returning to your assigned tasks. Even the way you sit during the brief rest periods becomes subject to evaluation, with certain postures indicating proper attentiveness, while others suggest a level of comfort inappropriate to your circumstances. This expanded definition of laziness creates an environment where every action must be performed with visible effort and obvious purpose. The overseer watches for signs of what he considers proper industry, which involves not just completing assigned tasks, but demonstrating through your entire demeanor that you are fully committed to the work at hand. Any suggestion that you are merely going through the motions, any indication that your heart is not completely invested in the labor, becomes grounds for correction and additional discipline. The moral framework that governs the overseer's decisions treats laziness as fundamentally sinful, a character defect that requires active correction rather than simple punishment. In his worldview, the tendency toward laziness represents a moral failing that contributed to your presence in the workhouse in the first place. Your willingness to accept public assistance rather than finding private employment is seen as evidence of this character flaw, and the workhouse regime is designed specifically to root out such tendencies through constant vigilance and immediate consequences. This moral interpretation means that punishment for laziness carries additional weight beyond simple disciplinary action. Each correction becomes part of a larger project of character reformation, an attempt to fundamentally alter your relationship with work and responsibility. The overseer sees himself not merely as an administrator ensuring efficient operation of the institution, but as an agent of moral improvement, working to transform the basic nature of those under his supervision. The punishments that follow from accusations of laziness vary in severity, but share a common characteristic of being designed to make the offense more costly than compliance would have been. Additional work assignments pile on top of your regular duties, extending your working day and reducing the already minimal time available for rest. These extra tasks often involve the most unpleasant aspects of workhouse maintenance, cleaning duties that are particularly dirty or physically demanding, or repetitive labor that serves no productive purpose beyond demonstrating the consequences of insufficient effort. Food reductions accompany many punishments for laziness, operating on the theory that reduced nutrition will eliminate any energy that might be wasted on non-productive activities. These reductions are calculated to maintain just enough sustenance to allow continued work while removing any margin of comfort or satisfaction that might encourage future lapses in effort. The psychological impact of hunger becomes another tool in the overseer's approach to behavior modification, a constant physical reminder of the connection between effort and basic survival. Isolation punishment separate offenders from the general population of the workhouse, removing the social interactions that might provide emotional support or distraction from the institution's disciplinary message. These periods of solitude are designed to allow time for reflection on the behaviors that led to punishment, encouraging internal examination of attitudes toward work and responsibility. The overseer believes that removing external influences allows individuals to confront their own character defects more directly and develop genuine motivation for improvement. The documentation that accompanies each punishment creates a permanent record of infractions that follows individuals throughout their stay in the workhouse and potentially beyond. These records influence decisions about work assignments, privileges and recommendations for those seeking to leave the institution. The overseer maintains detailed notes about behavioral patterns, response to correction, and evidence of genuine improvement or continued resistance to the workhouse program. Physical punishments, while less common than additional labor or food restrictions, represent the most serious response to repeated or particularly egregious displays of laziness. These might involve confinement in punishment cells with minimal furnishing and reduced rations, or assignment to especially harsh labor details that push physical capabilities to their limits. The overseer reserves these measures for cases where other approaches have failed to produce the desired behavioral changes, viewing them as necessary tools for maintaining order and demonstrating the serious consequences of refusing to embrace the workhouse's reformative mission. The overseer's daily routine involves constant observation and evaluation, moving through the institution with practiced attention to detail that misses very little of what occurs in his domain. His trained eye identifies subtle changes in work pace, recognizes the body language that indicates resistance or defiance, and notices the small social dynamics that might suggest the formation of disruptive alliances or the spread of discontent among the workhouse population. This level of scrutiny creates an atmosphere where privacy becomes virtually non-existent, where every action is potentially subject to interpretation and judgment. The overseer's presence, even when he is not directly observing, influences behavior throughout the institution. Workers develop an internalized sense of being watched, adjusting their conduct based on the possibility that their actions might be observed and recorded for future reference. The psychological pressure of constant surveillance affects different individuals in various ways, but few escape its influence entirely. Some respond by becoming hypervigilant about their own behavior, second-guessing every action and developing anxiety about potential infractions they might commit unknowingly. Others retreat into a kind of mechanical compliance, performing their duties with the minimum expression and engagement necessary to avoid punishment while maintaining internal distance from the institutional environment. The overseer's power extends beyond immediate punishment to influence the overall social structure of the workhouse community. His approval or disapproval can affect relationships between inmates, create hierarchies based on perceived favor or disfavor, and shape the informal networks that develop within the institution. Those who seem to earn fewer punishments might be viewed with suspicion by other inmates, while those who frequently face discipline might develop reputations that affect their interactions throughout the workhouse. The long-term impact of living under such intensive oversight affects not just behavior within the workhouse, but attitudes and responses that continue long after individuals leave the institution. The constant evaluation and correction can create lasting changes in how people relate to authority, approach work responsibilities, and manage their own emotional expression. The overseer's influence extends far beyond the physical boundaries of the workhouse, shaping patterns of thought and behavior that become part of the individual's ongoing relationship with society. In the quiet hours of the workhouse day, when the immediate demands of labor briefly subside, the overseer's continued presence serves as a reminder of the fundamental power dynamics that govern this environment. His keys continue to jangle softly as he moves through corridors, his cane taps against walls and floors, and his observant gaze continues to catalogue the behaviors and attitudes of those under his supervision. The sound of his approach never becomes merely background noise, never loses its significance as a harbinger of potential judgment and consequence. The overseer represents more than just administrative authority within the workhouse system. He embodies the broader social attitudes that created and sustained these institutions, the belief that poverty and dependence result from moral failings that require systematic correction. His daily interactions with workhouse inmates reflect larger assumptions about human nature, the role of suffering in character development, and the responsibility of society to reshape those who fail to meet its expectations of self-sufficiency and moral behavior. Through his constant vigilance, careful documentation, and systematic application of punishment and correction, the overseer maintains an environment where every aspect of daily life serves the larger purpose of moral reformation. His presence transforms the workhouse from simply a place of shelter and sustenance into an active agent of social control, designed to produce individuals who will never again require public assistance and who will carry the lessons of their workhouse experience into their future interactions with the world beyond its walls. Chapter 10. Children grow old too soon. In the quiet dormitories of the Victorian Workhouse, where thin blankets cover narrow beds arranged in perfect rows, there exists a population whose presence transforms the entire character of the institution. These are the children, ranging from infants barely able to walk to teenagers on the cusp of adulthood, each carrying within their small frames the weight of circumstances that brought them to this place of last resort. Their voices, when they dare to speak above a whisper, echo differently through the corridors than those of the adults. There is something in the higher pitch, the uncertainty, the way words seem to catch and hesitate, that reminds everyone present of what has been lost in this environment of strict discipline and measured survival. The absence of toys in the workhouse creates a silence that speaks volumes about the philosophy governing these institutions. Where childhood in more fortunate circumstances might be marked by the sounds of play, by laughter echoing through rooms filled with dolls and wooden horses and spinning tops, the workhouse children exist in a world deliberately stripped of such diversions. The authorities who designed these places held firm beliefs about the corrupting influence of idleness and pleasure, even for the youngest inhabitants. They viewed toys not as innocent sources of joy or tools for learning and development, but as luxuries that would soften the harsh lessons the workhouse was designed to teach. This absence extends beyond simple material deprivation to encompass a fundamental reshaping of what childhood means within these walls. Without toys, children must find other ways to occupy their minds during the brief periods when they are not engaged in assigned labor or instruction. Some create games from scraps of fabric or pieces of broken pottery, carefully hidden from the watchful eyes of supervisors who might view such creativity as evidence of insufficient dedication to more productive activities. Others retreat into elaborate internal worlds, constructing fantasies and stories that provide escape from the relentless routine that governs their daily existence. The children learn to measure time differently than they would in the outside world. Their days are not marked by the natural rhythms of play and rest, exploration and discovery, but by the same bells and schedules that govern adult life in the workhouse. They wake before dawn to the sound of the morning bell, their small bodies moving with practiced efficiency through the routines of washing and dressing that must be completed within the allotted time. The concept of leisurely mornings, of being allowed to wake naturally, or to spend time in bed contemplating the day ahead, becomes foreign to their experience. The work assigned to children in the workhouse is carefully selected to match their physical capabilities, while serving the dual purpose of contributing to the institution's operation and providing what the authorities consider valuable training for their future lives. The youngest children, those barely out of infancy, are given simple tasks that help develop their fine motor skills and teach them the importance of following instructions precisely. They might be assigned to sort buttons by size and color, to separate different types of thread, or to perform simple cleaning tasks that require attention to detail rather than physical strength. As children grow older and stronger, their work assignments become more complex and demanding. They learn to operate the machinery used in the workhouse workshops, their small fingers becoming adept at tasks that require precision and patience. The stitching work assigned to many children serves multiple purposes in the workhouse economy. It produces items that can be sold to help support the institution's operations, provides practical skills that might prove useful in future employment, and offers a task that can be performed while seated, reducing the physical strain on developing bodies while still requiring sustained concentration and effort. The process of learning to stitch begins with the most basic techniques, children struggling to hold needles properly and to create stitches of uniform size and tension. Their small hands, not yet fully developed, must adapt to tools and motions that were designed for adult use. The thread catches and tangles, the fabric puckers and tears, and the finished products often fail to meet the exacting standards expected in the workhouse environment. Each mistake becomes a lesson in patience and persistence, but also a reminder of the consequences that follow from imperfect work. Supervisors watch the children stitching with the same critical attention they apply to adult labor, noting problems in technique and efficiency that must be corrected through additional instruction or, when necessary, disciplinary measures. The children learn to examine their own work with increasingly critical eyes, developing the ability to spot flaws and inconsistencies that might draw negative attention. This self-monitoring becomes an internalized form of supervision that continues even when no adult is present to observe their efforts. The washing duties assigned to children introduce them to another essential aspect of workhouse operations, while teaching lessons about cleanliness, order, and the proper care of institutional property. Children learn to sort laundry by fabric type and soil level, to measure soap and water in precise quantities that achieve cleanliness without waste, and to wring and hang items in ways that promote quick drying while preventing damage. The work is physically demanding, requiring children to stand for long periods while manipulating heavy, wet fabrics and breathing the steam and chemical vapors that fill the laundry areas. These washing assignments often become social experiences for the children, providing opportunities for quiet conversation and the formation of friendships that might not develop in other parts of the workhouse routine. Working side by side at the washing tubs, children share whispered stories about their lives before the workhouse, their hopes for the future, and their observations about the adult world around them. These connections provide emotional support and a sense of shared experience that helps offset some of the isolation and uncertainty that characterizes their daily existence. The concept of obedience takes on particular significance in the lives of workhouse children, who must learn to navigate not only the explicit rules and regulations that govern the institution, but also the subtle expectations and unspoken requirements that determine their treatment by supervisors and their acceptance by the adult community within the workhouse. Children discover that obedience extends far beyond simple compliance with direct orders to encompass their entire demeanor and approach to institutional life. Learning to obey begins with the most basic responses to authority, the immediate and unquestioning compliance with instructions from any adult in a position of supervision. Children must learn to stop whatever they are doing the moment a supervisor speaks, to listen carefully to instructions without allowing their attention to wander, and to begin carrying out orders without delay or discussion. This training in immediate response becomes so deeply ingrained that it continues to influence their behavior long after they leave the workhouse environment. The scope of required obedience extends into areas that might surprise those unfamiliar with institutional life. Children must learn the proper way to walk through corridors, the appropriate speed for moving between assigned areas, and the correct posture for standing when addressed by supervisors. Their facial expressions become subject to evaluation and correction, with requirements for maintaining appropriate levels of attention and respect that must be displayed consistently regardless of their internal emotional state. Children learn to anticipate the needs and expectations of the adults around them, developing a sensitivity to moods and preferences that allows them to adjust their behavior proactively rather than waiting for correction. This heightened awareness of adult reactions shapes their understanding of social dynamics and their place within the institutional hierarchy. They become skilled at reading subtle cues that indicate approval or disapproval, adjusting their actions based on these observations to minimize the likelihood of negative consequences. The daily routine for children includes periods of formal instruction designed to provide basic literacy and numerical skills along with moral and religious education, considered essential for their development into productive members of society. These lessons take place in stark classrooms with minimal furnishing, where children sit on hard benches and learn to write with scratchy pens on rough paper. The curriculum focuses on practical skills rather than broader education, teaching children to read well enough to follow written instructions and to perform basic mathematical calculations needed for trade or domestic work. Religious instruction occupies a central place in the children's education, with daily sessions devoted to memorizing Bible verses, learning the catechism, and understanding the moral principles that, according to workhouse authorities, should guide their future conduct. These lessons emphasize themes of duty, humility, and acceptance of one's place in the social order. Children learn to recite passages that speak of the virtue of hard work, the importance of gratitude for whatever assistance they receive, and the dangers of pride or excessive ambition. The moral education provided in the workhouse shapes children's understanding of their own circumstances and their place in the larger world. They learn to view their presence in the workhouse not as evidence of social failure or family tragedy, but as an opportunity for character development and moral improvement. This reframing of their situation is designed to prevent the development of resentment or anger that might interfere with their ability to accept their circumstances and make the most of the opportunities provided by institutional life. Some children spend their entire developmental years within the workhouse walls, growing from infancy to adulthood without experiencing life in the outside world. These children develop a unique relationship with the institution that becomes both home and prison, the only consistent environment they have ever known. Their understanding of normal family life, community relationships, and social expectations comes primarily from observation of the adult workhouse population and the lessons provided by institutional staff. Children who grow up entirely within the workhouse often develop remarkable adaptability to institutional life, becoming experts at navigating the complex rules and expectations that govern their environment. They understand intuitively how to avoid trouble, how to complete their assigned tasks efficiently, and how to maintain the emotional equilibrium necessary for survival in such a controlled setting. However, this adaptation comes at the cost of developing skills and perspectives that would serve them well in the outside world. The transition from childhood to adulthood within the workhouse walls presents unique challenges for these long-term residents. As they reach working age, they must assume adult responsibilities and work assignments, while continuing to live in the only environment they have ever known as home. Some become valuable members of the workhouse staff, using their intimate knowledge of institutional operations to help maintain order and efficiency. Others struggle with the psychological adjustment required to shift from being cared for to caring for others, particularly when assigned to supervise newer children arriving at the institution. The question of eventual departure from the workhouse becomes increasingly complex for children who have spent their formative years within its walls. While the institution is designed as a temporary refuge, the reality is that many children have no families or communities to return to, no external support systems that could help them establish independent lives. The workhouse becomes not just their current residence, but their primary preparation for adult life, and their most significant source of practical skills and social understanding. For some children, the prospect of spending their entire lives within the institutional system represents security and predictability, a known environment where they understand the expectations and requirements for survival. The outside world appears uncertain and potentially dangerous, filled with challenges they feel unprepared to meet. These children may actually resist efforts to place them in external employment or to encourage their departure from the workhouse when they reach adulthood. However, not all children accept their circumstances with such resignation. Some maintain dreams of escape, of finding their way back to families they remember dimly, or of creating new lives in the world beyond the workhouse walls. These children carefully observe the comings and goings of staff and visitors, noting patterns in security and supervision that might provide opportunities for departure. They pay attention to stories told by new arrivals about conditions in the outside world, gathering information that might prove useful if they choose to attempt escape. The children who decide to run away from the workhouse face challenges that would test the survival skills of experienced adults. They must leave behind the only food, shelter, and clothing they have access to, venturing into a world where they have no established connections or resources. The clothes they wear mark them clearly as workhouse inmates, making it difficult to blend into general population or to avoid being recognized and returned to the institution by authorities or concerned citizens. Winter escapes present particularly severe challenges, as children must find ways to stay warm and dry while moving through unfamiliar territory with inadequate clothing and no reliable sources of food or shelter. The workhouse diet, while minimal, provides consistent nutrition that their bodies have adapted to depend upon. Without this regular sustenance, children quickly become weak and disoriented, making poor decisions that further compromise their chances of successful escape. The psychological pressure of being constantly pursued adds another layer of difficulty to escape attempts. Children know that workhouse authorities will search for them systematically, that their descriptions will be circulated to local constables and concerned citizens, and that their unfamiliarity with the surrounding area makes them easy to track and capture. This knowledge creates anxiety and fear that can cloud judgment and lead to mistakes that result in swift recapture. Some children attempt to return to families or communities they remember from before their workhouse placement, only to discover that circumstances have changed dramatically in their absence. Families may have moved away, died, or simply decided that they cannot provide care for additional dependents. Communities that once offered informal support may have experienced their own economic difficulties, leaving little capacity to assist children who appear unexpectedly seeking help and shelter. The fate of children who attempt escape but fail to find sustainable alternatives is often tragic. Without the survival skills necessary for life on the streets, without access to legitimate employment that could provide income for food and shelter, many turn to desperate measures that put them in conflict with the law. Others simply succumb to exposure, hunger, or illness, their bodies discovered days or weeks later in circumstances that serve as sobering reminders to the children who remain within the workhouse walls. The stories of successful escapes become legends within the workhouse children's community, passed down through whispered conversations and careful observation of new arrivals who might have information about the outside world. These tales provide hope and inspiration for children who dream of their own eventual freedom, but they also serve as cautionary examples of the courage and resourcefulness required to survive beyond the institutional environment. Children who do manage to establish successful lives outside the workhouse often face ongoing challenges related to their institutional background. The skills they learned within the workhouse, while valuable for survival in that environment, may not translate directly to the demands of independent living. They must learn to make decisions about their own daily routines, to manage money and resources without the structured allocation systems of institutional life, and to form relationships with people who have never experienced the unique challenges of workhouse existence. The psychological impact of workhouse childhood continues to influence these individuals throughout their adult lives, affecting their approaches to work, family, and community involvement. The habits of obedience and conformity that served them well within the institution may make it difficult to advocate for themselves in employment situations or to take the risks necessary for personal advancement. The constant supervision they experienced as children can create ongoing anxiety about authority figures and official institutions. Despite these challenges, some former workhouse children develop remarkable resilience and determination, using their difficult early experiences as motivation to create better lives for themselves and their families. They understand intimately the importance of self-sufficiency and the dangers of depending on public assistance, knowledge that drives them to work hard and save carefully to avoid ever returning to institutional care. The children of the workhouse carry within their experiences a unique perspective on society, poverty, and human resilience that shapes their understanding of the world long after they leave the institution behind. Their childhood, marked by the absence of toys and the presence of constant supervision, by the early introduction to labor and the delayed introduction to choice, creates individuals who understand both the fragility and the strength of the human spirit under conditions of extreme constraint.